Okay, welcome everyone. Hello to those of you who've just joined us in the session. I see we're just creeping up to over 100 attendees now, so I think that's a good point for us to kick off the session. So, a big welcome and thanks for joining us at today's workshop on managing and reporting on nature. I'm Fiona Quinlan-Wells from the UN SSE team, and it's great to be here with you today. So before we start, just a few thank yous from my side. A big thank you to all of our partners on this program who help make the work possible, to the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures, to the UN Development Programme, to ICI, the climate initiative of the German government, and of course, a special thanks today to the team at the National Stock Exchange, NSE, for hosting us. Last but not least, of course, thank you all as participants for taking the time out of your day for this workshop. So, to kick us off in the session, I'm very pleased we're joined today by Vinita Shetty, who's the Managing Director for NSE's Sustainability Ratings and Analytics Division. So, big thank you for joining us, Vinita, and I'll pass over to you now for your opening comments.
Thank you. A very warm afternoon to everybody present. So it is our absolute pleasure to host this session organized by the Sustainable Stock Exchange and TNFD, and more so around this time where sustainability conversation is expanding decisively from climate alone to a broader question of nature, ecosystems, and long-term resilience. So, across the global markets, the message is now becoming unmistakably clear that nature related dependencies and impacts are no longer just peripheral to the environment concerns, they are increasingly material to the enterprise value, to the capital allocation, to the financial stability. And from an India perspective, this discussion carries significance considering the growth that is happening at this stage and how deeply it is connected to the nature overall. And that is precisely why TNFD framework is so relevant from the Indian market's perspective, because it helps translate nature related exposures into this decision useful information for companies, investors, institutions overall. At NSE Sustainability Ratings and Analytics, a subsidiary of National Stock Exchange, we see this as a part of the broader market transition from sustainability as a narrative to sustainability as a measurable risk. As a SEBI registered ERP, our role is to provide transparent, data driven, and materiality based ESG assessments that reflect the most relevant risk and opportunity for the companies that are under assessment. And especially this is more important in the TNFD context is that, you know, for India, this is not something that we are starting from the scratch. The evolution of BRSR reporting has already created a strong domestic foundation here. So the recent India-focused guidance developed around TNFD and BRSR shows a high degree of this alignment between the two, with most of TNFD's recommendations across governance, strategy, risk management already reflected as a part of the BRSR architecture. So, this alignment matters greatly for the capital markets over here. It means that Indian companies already have a practical pathway to strengthen the nature related transparency without now building an entirely separate reporting universe. And it means that the investors can increasingly evaluate the nature related preparedness using a combination of the domestic reporting discipline and globally relevant analytical frameworks. So BRSR and the TNFD alignment guidance, it also touches upon areas highly relevant to the nature related analysis, including ecologically sensitive locations, stakeholder engagement, and the management context around the environmental risk. So in our ratings framework, these are not viewed in isolation. They've now become a part of the broader assessment of the resilience, the governance, the operating exposure, and the long term sustainability performance. So, the value of TNFD is that it helps deepen this assessment. It's four pillar structure: the governance strategy, risk and impact management, and the metrics and targets provide a clear framework for understanding how the companies identify and manage their interfaces with nature. And through the LEAP approach, which is the locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, TNFD gives the organization a practical way to identify nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities in a very structured and a decision useful manner. So, at NSE Sustainability, we believe that it is our responsibility to help markets navigate the shift with rigor, transparency, and relevance. So, by combining the BRSR based disclosure, materiality led analysis, sector specific assessment, and robust ESG ratings, we aim to give investors greater clarity, give issuers stronger benchmarks, and support a more resilient capital allocation across the Indian markets. Thank you so very much. I would now request Mr. Gaurav Yadav from NSE to talk more around the capital market related initiatives that have been taken more from the sustainability bonds, the green bonds, and the other developments that are happening in the space around the exchange framework. Gaurav, over to you, please.
Thank you, Vinita ji, and thank you to all the participants for joining this session. And to add what Vinita ji just had mentioned, that prior to this, NAC and all other financial institutions were recognized via that we are having financial instruments which are directly using all the proceeds or the investments into the equity or the debt side. But now, what had changed after all these years? So, like, if we do start, if we start to evaluating what, like in a BRSR context, what Vinita ji had mentioned earlier. So the BRSR part, what has been introduced by the stock exchanges in India, and which the entities have to report on, because I am seeing all the portfolio of the participants here today. They are the ESG practitioners, or they are the sustainability or the CSR funds of particular you can say organizations. So the main motto was to just stock take the data first, what all emissions at a you can say corporate level all those entities are doing and how they are doing it. And we had also added up the aspects of E and S and G parameter in it as well, because prior to this we were just only reporting out on those financial disclosures. If we talk about the BRR, where we just as of for our business requirement have to submit out few things, but those were mainly the financial parameters. Now, with the introduction of BRSR, all the non-financial disclosures have been also included in the particular quantum of all those suits. So, how this is adding up, how this is helping the organizations, or you can say the investors to come and identify. Supposedly, there is an investor sitting in USA, sitting in anywhere around the country, around the world, sorry. So they will see, they will come, they will you can say scroll through that all BRSAR data what we have, and supposedly they want to invest in some organization who is doing good in their S parameter, or doing good in their governance mechanism, or doing good in mitigating their overall emissions. So this BRSR complete structure, what is we had created to stock take that ESNG parameter data, is helping the investors to redirecting their you can say investment to a cause what they had think in their mind they have to do. So the BRSR part, apart from the BRSR thing, the stock take thing, you also need to mitigate your emissions. You have to also do your you can say policies more better. So for that the finance is required. So for that, like in if I can say, like in last 2-3 years, NSE and the capital market, you can say ecosystem had given all the you can say listed organization entities with a solution. So we at a sovereign, if we say from 2017, the municipal green bonds were available. You can go and you can issue the green debt securities. But if we say about the corporates, there were OTC products available which were not inside the purview of the regulatory boundary of capital markets. So last year in 2025, on 5th June 2025, we had also issued our ESG debt securities, under which there are sustainability linked bonds as well as sustainability bonds, and the social bonds as well, all the GESS plus and transition bonds what we state around. So under that, your proceeds, whatever debt you or whatever refinancing you will be doing, that complete proceed will be utilized towards the sustainability cause. Let's if we can take an example of L&T case, in that they might be having their net zero targets, including scope 1 and scope 2. So whatever issuance they had done here, they had might send some of the KPIs under which the commitment, whether under any protocol, whatsoever protocol it was that it was given, so they will mitigate or they will reduce their overall emissions basis that their you can say the issuance what they had did, they have to repay basis that only. And if they fail on any of the KPI, the BIPs will go a bit of higher. So all these structures are available. So ESG debt securities is available, municipal green bonds are available, and in forthcoming future we will be also introducing our green equity principles, under which what will happen, a company who is coming for IPO issuance will be tagged along with their green investments, or how much of their percentage of revenue is coming out from the greener things. So supposedly, if a company having more than 75% of their revenue coming out from the green activities or from the renewable thing, they will be given a dark green designation when they will come for their IPO issuance. That will give more traction towards the to the investors to come and invest in that particular organization, because you can say a saying which is we normally do hear from everyone: if it's a renewable, if it's a green organization, it will overall grow in coming years. And for the nature part, for which this complete you can say agenda or today's complete webinar is organized towards, in the BRSR aspect only, we had also last to last year had included the green credits as well, which is a officialate government of India's that bucket of green activities which a corporate have to do. So anyone interested in that can go visit Ministry of Environment and Climate Change website. From there, learn the green credit things as well after hearing to this complete session. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining for today's webinar.
Thanks so much, Gaurav, and also to Vinita. Great to hear so much work on the go with the exchange, and already that fantastic interconnection coming through between nature, your reporting frameworks, and that real understanding of the relevance, as you say, for financial resilience. So thanks so much for setting the scene so well for us there at the start of the session. Really appreciate it. Excellent. Okay, so from my side then, I'm just going to cover a few practical points about how today's session will work before we start to get into the content. So probably as an attendee by now, you will have noticed that you're muted, but that's not to say that we don't want you to interact with us. So great to see so many people already sharing in the chat their comments. Please feel free to continue to do that throughout the session. We'd encourage you, if you have particular questions for the team, to put those into the Q&A box. We'd love to take the opportunity to answer your questions as we move through the session, but use the Q&A box if you can, because that just makes us able to track your questions and answer them directly, whereas the chat will get a bit busy with comments and we might lose them there. In terms of our format for today, we've got a live 3.5-hour workshop with you now. We will take a break in the middle of that, I'm sure you're pleased to hear. And we did have a short pre-watch video that we had asked you to watch in advance of today's session. Hopefully you had the time to do that, but if not, we're going to recap on some of the key concepts, and you're also welcome to watch that after the session as well. We'll share the link to that later in the chat. As I've already mentioned, that live opportunity to ask your question for the experts, I think, is one of the great things about these workshops. So please do make the most of that opportunity and ask your questions as we go along. Otherwise, we'd really also encourage and kind of require your participation in the session as well. We're going to be using a number of different tools to interact with you, including Mentimeter and the polls in Zoom. So please do take part in those. And finally, if you join us for today's live workshop, you'll be able to receive a CPD certified completion certificate for taking part. So to get your certificate, we'll share the details with you at the end of the session, but it will involve filling out a feedback survey and a quiz that we'll share with you at the end. And you'll receive that in an email after the session as well. Another key thing to mention is that all of the presentation materials from today's session and the guidance document that sits alongside it, which we'll be referring to, are available to download from the SSE's website. So if you go to the event webpage for today's session, which we'll share with you in the chat just now, at the bottom of that page, you'll find the resources for today's session. You'll also find that pre-watch video there that I mentioned. And additionally, we'll add the recording from today's training to that page as well after the session. So, in terms of our objectives from this training, there's a few key things that we're hoping to help you achieve. So, through the video, our emphasis was really around explaining why nature is relevant for your organization. And we'll recap that with you shortly as well. And then, in terms of the focus for our live session today, there's three key areas we're looking at. Firstly, to be familiar with what resources are available to support management and disclosure on nature, particularly drawing from the TNFD's materials. Secondly, to understand how to identify, assess, and manage nature related issues. And finally, to think about who requires this information and how you can best integrate it into your public disclosures. So, to help us achieve those objectives, we've developed a 4 module structure that you'll see on the screen now. So, module 1, as I said, will be recapped today, but that was included in the video that we shared with you. Module 2, Align, is all around setting the direction for your approach and aligning with the TNFD's framework and guidance. In our 3rd module, Implement, we'll be looking at practices and systems, so how to get started on assessing nature issues using the LEAP approach. And then Communicate will finish by thinking about public disclosures and how to engage stakeholder groups as well. And this just shows you how that time breaks down across the session. Today, we'll spend a little bit of time on our first module recap, a fairly even amount of time on each of the modules, a little bit more on our implement module, and we'll take a little break in the middle of the session before we wrap up at the end with sharing some resources and takeaways as well. So to give you an overview of who's going to be presenting today, so I've mentioned I'm Fiona, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Tiffany Grabsky, head of the SSE Academy, and Landon Wilcock, the SSE Project Officer as well. Hi to both of them. We're also pleased today to be joined by Tejashwa Goyal, who is the Market Engagement Lead for the Asia Pacific region at the TNFD. So big thanks, TJ, for joining us. And alongside us as well, we have our guest speakers joining us today from S&P Global as well. We've got Valentina Perillo Campo, who is an ESG client engagement specialist at S&P Global, who'll be presenting to us shortly on the investor perspective on nature issues. And then later in our training, we'll have Yusuf Fink joining us, who's the Director for Climate and Sustainability Services, who'll be talking us through a case study of LEAP. So thanks both as well for being here. And then another approach that we've taken in this training is we know it's always really helpful to hear from companies who are actually in the process of adopting the TNFD and who have also contributed to its development. So we have video clips that we've interspersed today from a representative JSW Group, an Indian-based steel company represented by Harshal Limdi. So I'll let Harshal introduce him now with a quick video, and we'll come back to him a few times during the session.
Hi, my name is Harshal Limdi, part of JSW Group, heading Environment and Biodiversity Vertical from the corporate. JSW Group has very strong presence in steel, energy, paints, automotive, and cement sector. We are having our headquarters in India, and our group turnover is around 30 billion US dollars. So that's about me.
Great. So that just gives you a little bit of an introduction to Harshal, who we'll come back to, as I said, later in the session. So to get us started now, to hear from you for the first time, we're going to do our first poll. And this question is just to get a sense of how well do you think that you currently understand the link between nature and business? And we'll test this again at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to see some improvement. But of course, you may already know a little bit about this topic. So you can use that rating scale from 0 to 10 to let us know maybe from completely new to this topic and a beginner on the 0 and 1s kind of side, up to 9 and 10, maybe you're quite familiar with this already. So I'll give you all a few seconds to respond. Great to see lots of you participating in the polls already. And then we'll see what that picture is. Okay. Let's end the poll there since I see we've responded quite quickly. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I see the results here are quite mixed. We've got a lot of people actually spread across the scale, but it looks like most of us already know a little bit about nature and business together. And then maybe the most common option is somewhere in the middle of the spectrum at the moment. So great to understand that. And as we said, hopefully we'll be able to see some improvement on that as we move through the session. So, moving into our next thing, I think one thing that we'd really like to make sure that we're clear on at the start are definitions for some of the key terms that we're using in today's training. So, if you've watched our video, you've probably already seen a definition of these terms, and this is just a reminder. But if you didn't, I think it's important that we get clear. So, now we're going to use Menti to help us have a little bit of a think about what the definitions of nature and some related terms might be. So, if I'd ask my colleagues just to share the link to Menti in the chat, and then I'll share my screen with you now as well to show you some other ways to join us in Menti as well. Hey. So Landon's just shared a link in the chat. Thanks, Landon, that you can follow to go directly to this question. But you can also use these options available on the screen now. There's a QR code, or also go to menti.com and enter that code there. I'll leave these instructions up on the side of the screen. You see them here if you need to still join us. But for those of you who've already arrived in Menti, our first question here is just to get a sense of how would you define nature and what do you think this word means? So you can just share one or two words that summarize what you think the definition of nature contains, or maybe some words that come to mind for you currently when you think about nature. So just to be clear, we're not expecting word perfect answers here. So don't worry if you don't get it right on the first try. Of course, that's what we're all here to do, is to learn and understand this topic better. But great to see so many of you sharing already. So let's see, I'm seeing life, flora and fauna, ecosystems. What else have we got? I'll just make my screen a bit bigger so I can see all your answers. There's so many. Resources, dynamic ecosystems, environment, life sustaining, whole ecosystems. Fantastic. Okay, loads of really good points there already. I think you're getting a lot of the key concepts here, really, that nature connects to all naturally occurring living and non-living components of the earth. So loads of words there, I think, that are capturing aspects of what we're going to be looking at. After we finished taking our guests, we'll have a little bit of a look at the official definition as well, just to confirm that. But it looks like you all already have a lot of good thoughts on this. So, a second question, we know this term also comes up quite often as well, and it'd be good to understand what you think biodiversity means, maybe compared to nature. So, we sometimes use these terms interchangeably, but actually they're a little bit different. So, let's see if you have any thoughts on maybe what the meaning of biodiversity could be. Okay, variety, I think that's a very good word. Species, harmony, natural variation, subsets. Oh, we don't need to do any more training. It looks like everyone already knows what we're talking about here. Fantastic. Well done, everyone. So I think a lot of the right words I see coming through here about variation, variety, species variation. It's all about, as the name would suggest, the diversity of different organisms. Um, Great. Well, it looks like that works well to get everyone into Menti as well. So we'll come back to Menti later in the session. So please keep that link open. But let's return to the slides now, and we'll just recap for you on the official definitions, which I think are very close, really, to what you've already shared with us here. Great. So our two key definitions here, drawing from the work of the TNFD, and the TNFD's work really builds on a lot of other organizations in this space as well. So their definitions have designed to be aligned to that. So the TNFD defines nature, drawing from the Convention on Biological Diversity. They really place an emphasis on the living components of nature. However, nature does comprise the living and non-living elements of nature. So living elements, obviously flora, fauna, the renewing or living aspects, whereas non-living could also include energy and minerals, but they're probably emphasized to a lesser extent. So overall, nature is really the broad concept encompassing all naturally occurring living and non-living components of the earth. So, whereas nature is that broad concept, biodiversity is a perhaps more specific characteristic of nature that specifically refers to the variability among living things, as many as you already gave us in your Menti answers. So, this is talking about the thinking of nature as a varied collection of plants, animals, microorganisms, and the ecosystems they inhabit. So we could consider this in the example of a forest. So if we think of nature as the overall large, healthy forest, biodiversity would be referring to the variety of life within that forest, the different species of trees, the animals, the fungi, the microorganisms, and so on. And so, of course, having the entire forest or nature is important to provide the space and resources. Actually, biodiversity or that variety of species is a really important aspect in making that forest resilient and functional. So, ultimately, nature and biodiversity are both really important and slightly distinct concepts. So, this is something that's useful to keep in mind throughout the training. If you're interested to know more about this or look at any other definitions, you can take a look at the TNFD glossary, which is available in the slide handout on this slide. You can connect to it using the URL. Okay, fantastic. So that, I think, got us clear on some of the starting concepts. And I'm going to pass you over to Tiffany now to cover Module 1.
Great. Thanks so much, Fiona, and hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Good to see that you're very acquainted with the basic terminology of nature and biodiversity. So we're just going to quickly do a recap of the first module, Understand, which hopefully you watched in the video that we already sent you to prepare for today's session. But if you haven't, I do recommend you watching this after the session. It really sets the groundwork for this topic and makes sure that you have a strong foundation on nature. Great. So a quick overview of that module we did in the video. There we looked at why nature matters and why it's critical to act on nature at all scales. We also looked at what businesses should know about nature and the key considerations to get started in understanding the topic. And to round off this section, today we're also going to finish off this module in the live workshop with a further unit. And that's working with our guest speaker, SMP, Valentina, who's here. So thanks so much for joining us for that. Now let's do a quick recap of what you looked at already in the video. And we're going to go to a poll to ask you a question. We're doing a quick quiz to see who might have watched the video and maybe who didn't. So this poll is asking you, how many of the 9 planetary boundaries have we already breached? And I'm happy to see that actually the majority of you are getting it right so far. So I'll just give you maybe 5 more seconds to fill that in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. So well done, everyone. 7 is the correct answer. Now, it started off with everyone saying 7. Maybe it was those that were like very sure because they had watched the video, and then 4 crept in. But the answer is indeed 7. And what's interesting is quite a few of you said 9. 23% think all of them have been breached already, which is quite scary, but we're getting close. Just as a reminder from the video, in 2025, scientific assessments showed indeed that 7 out of the 9 planetary boundaries had been transgressed. And what's important to highlight is that climate change is actually just one of them. That's why we talk about and I think we have, an image there that you might remember from the video. So this is why we talk about nature beyond climate. We need a much more integrated perspective, one that recognizes how biodiversity and land use, fresh water, nutrient cycles, and many other systems are actually really interconnected. And we need to act with real urgency because these systems are already under significant stress, as we can see. We also talked about the fact that multiple ecosystem services are in decline. And as a reminder, ecosystem services are simply the benefits we get from nature. So these are things like clean water, fertile soil, food, pollination, protection from storms, and even the regulation of our climate. They're sort of the natural systems that quietly support our lives and our economies every day. So the leading global scientific body that assesses these trends, called IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, in 2019 warned in its global assessment that many of these ecosystem services are declining around the world, and we need urgent action to reverse that. Now let's move on to the next section we covered in Module 1, and that is that every economy in the world ultimately depends to some extent on nature. And by extension, so does every business. At the moment, a lot of the value businesses extract from nature isn't fully priced into business valuation. Water, clean air, fertile soils, stable weather, these are all essential inputs, but companies often don't pay the true cost of using or even damaging them. So why does this matter? Well, because fundamentally, businesses and nature are systemically interconnected. Businesses rely on nature to operate, and we call these dependencies. And at the same time, business activities affect nature, and we call those impacts. So the diagram here is how the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, represents this relationship. So on the left, you see that nature and the services it provides, and on the right, you see the businesses, and the arrows show a two-way flow. So businesses depend on nature, and their actions impact nature in return. And when you put those dependencies and impacts together, they translate into risks and opportunities in companies. And this is why it's important to recognize that nature is not just an environmental issue. It's a core strategic risk for organizations. And what this means is that nature risk is financial risk. The future cash flows of a business, whether they are corporates or financial institutions, depends on a continuous flow of these so-called free benefits from nature. It's important to remember, however, that this isn't just about risk. Nature can also present powerful opportunities that have positive outcomes for both businesses and for nature. An opportunity doesn't always mean inventing something brand new. It can simply be applying what the business already does in a smaller, more sustainable way. And these opportunities can deliver benefits both by reducing negative impacts and creating positive outcomes for nature. So for example, as customer expectations shift, companies can access new markets or even new locations by responding to growing demand for nature-positive products and services. So while nature loss brings real risk, it can also open the doors to innovation, to efficiency, to new markets, and to stronger long-term resilience. So now I would like to do one more quiz with you. Now, another important thing to remind ourselves is that different aspects or realms of nature exist, and these are different components the TNFD uses to define what is part of the living natural world. So take a look at this list and select all of those that you think are correct. Which of these are considered the four realms of nature? And I'll give you just a moment to fill that in. I'd like to get half of you filling this in, but we're also on a time crunch, so I'm going to give you 5 more seconds again. So just take a quick guess. What are the four you think that are the four realms? 3, 2, 1. Well done, everyone. We got nearly 60% of you answering, so good engagement, everyone. We appreciate it. Okay, so the winners on your side, you said it was atmosphere, ocean, fresh water, and land. So let's remind ourselves of this image that we saw in the module 1. So as you can see from that, TNFD's framework is based on the 4 realms of land, fresh water, ocean, and atmosphere. Then society lies at the center of those 4 realms. Some of you picked society too, but this is what connects really all those 4 realms. And it really reflects that people are a part of nature. They're not separate from it. So that then brings us to our next poll, where here we're going to discuss 4 things that we talked about in module 1, but only one of these sentences is correct. So take a moment and read each one. The first one is nature issues are the same for everyone and should be tackled using a global approach. The second is that nature is connected to other risk types. The third is nature and climate should be approached separately. And the fourth is people and nature are two separate things and should be treated that way in risk management. So again, I'm just going to give you a few seconds, but I know this one takes a while to think through. Which one is correct? Only one of them is correct. And so far, I'll applaud you because not by a ton, but the right one is winning out. I'll give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Great job, everyone. Again, we got 60% of you participating. Great. So the second one, nature risk is connected to other risk types, is indeed correct. And nearly half of you picked that one. So good job. But let's go through each of these statements and see why the other ones were incorrect. So our first option indicated that nature was the same for everyone. Now, while climate change is a global process with one shared atmosphere, this is often how it's considered. But in contrast, nature and the drivers of nature change are actually location specific. So a business's nature-related dependencies and impacts on nature, which lead to risks and opportunities for businesses, are highly location and context dependent, shaped both by the sector in which a business operates and its geographic footprint. Organizations then need to consider sensitivity alongside the locations which present material nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities to their organizations to then filter and prioritize what they work on. Now, the second, number 2, the second option we had was that correct one. We face a systemic landscape of risks that are interconnected, often in surprising and unexpected ways, actually. So what is clear is that nature-related risks connect to and amplify other corporate risks. So that one you all got right is indeed correct. The next poll option, number 3, suggested that nature and climate should be separate, which is incorrect. So as we learned in the video, businesses respond to nature and climate, or their responses to nature and climate must be integrated, connected together. So there are 5 impact drivers of nature change, including climate change, but also land, freshwater or ocean use change, resource use, invasive species, and pollination. Climate change and the resulting increase in global temperatures is a driver of a nature degradation. The increasing frequency and intensity of flooding, wildfires, storms, this can disrupt the water cycles, it can alter soil temperatures, and it can accelerate habitat and wildlife loss. Nature degradation also drives climate risk. So the destruction of forests can accelerate climate change by releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and the destruction of wetlands and mangroves, for example, that provide protection against flooding can reduce climate resilience. So important to see climate and nature as integrated. The final option also said that what was separate was nature and people. But what's really important to have a clear understanding of is that people are a part of nature. And most of you got that right. So congratulations. People, especially Indigenous peoples and the local communities, rely on nature for their livelihoods and also play a really critical role as stewards in conserving and restoring ecosystems. So corporates and financial institutions cannot address nature loss by acting alone, by not engaging with people. Great. So I think that's a good overview of that. I'm going to pass to Landon to introduce our next section. Over to you, Landon.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany, and good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here with you today. So we've talked now about the business case and market case for nature-related disclosures, as well as some of the key concepts to understand when we're getting started on this topic and on nature disclosure. But now I want to consider some of the stakeholder groups that are interested in data and disclosure from businesses on nature. And as we've been discussing, nature is increasingly shaping business strategy, business risk, as well as business opportunities. And as that happens, stakeholder expectations are also rising rapidly. One particular stakeholder group this applies to, as well, it will be relevant to many of you joining us today from listed companies, is of course investors. Investors want to understand how nature risks could affect returns, creditworthiness, and long-term value. To help us get started on this topic, I'm pleased to introduce from S&P 1, Valentina, who's an expert on this subject, and she's going to help guide us through the investor and financial angle on nature and why it matters. So I'll turn it over to you now, Valentina, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, London, for the introduction, and thank you for the NSE as well for hosting and the UNSSE. I'm Valentina. I work for S&P Global in the sustainability team as an ESG client specialist. So the idea of the next couple of slides is to really start thinking about what are these impacts and dependencies and what do they look like, and how we can also help identify as well as assess and manage those location-specific related nature-related impacts. So what this figure is showing, the staggering figure really highlights the immense pressure that leading industries place on some of the planet's most biodiverse and ecologically significant regions. So from this assessment, based on the S&P Global 1200 study, the ecosystem footprint of the top sectors is equivalent to 32 million football pitches of the Amazon rainforest that are being impacted. So the staggering figure really starts to show as we start to confront the significant ecological footprint and major industries, it becomes increasingly clear that innovative kind of financial solutions are really essential for fostering kind of sustainability, but also helping to mitigate that nature-related risk. And, mitigation is kind of a core key thing when we focus on things like climate and as well as nature. So in the slide, what we're trying to reflect here is that we're examining nature dependency risks and impact metrics alongside the S&P World's index, cumulative index performance. And what we've seen from kind of the back testing performance is that the low kind of to high dependency rankings, companies with the lowest nature dependency risk are measured by scores outperformed the S&P World Index, while those that will have the kind of the highest nature dependency risk kind of underperformed. So this essentially highlights the financial relevance of managing kind of nature-related dependencies for certain companies as well. So here on the slide, we've kind of got this overall index of kind of the understanding of the energy climate transitions. So, it was previously highlighted about impact and dependencies, but, as we start to look at impacts of climate change, they become more material, right? So it is increasingly more important to start to recognize that also nature must be a part of this conversation as well as this equation that we're seeing. So especially as we mentioned, the energy transition aspect of it. So in this data, it basically includes kind of mines in different stages. So from the development side of it to the operational side, to late exploration and early exploration as well. Closed mines are excluded in this assessment that we're seeing here. But what we're seeing is that for minerals such as kind of lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and graphite, these are essential for those technologies that are really driving that low carbon transmission. So as global demand for these minerals accelerates and increases, mining activities are also kind of expanding into regions that are not only kind of mineral rich, but are also ecologically significant, right? So think of this as a kind of nature-based equivalent of a carbon footprint. So it measures the environmental impact of a company's operations, but also by doing this, it calculates the area of ecosystems that are essentially being affected. So in other words, it kind of shows how much natural land and habitat is impacted by those business activities. So as mentioned, kind of when we kind of talk about location and how that's important, we talk about key biodiversity areas. Now, these KBAs are specific geographic areas that are critical for those conversations of biodiversity. So they are identified based on kind of the importance for the persistence of biodiversity, including things like the species, the ecosystem, but also those ecological processes. So we're going to start kind of getting you thinking. So which percentage of companies of the S&P 1200 have operations with overlapping KBAs? So I'm just think there's a poll, yeah, the poll that's just coming up. So let's give you some time to answer that. So again, what percentage of those companies of the S&P 1200 do you think have operations overlapping with a key biodiversity area? Okay, so we've got leading at 40 to 49%, with 50 to 59% following a second, close second. We've also got the 79. Yep. So again, 40 to 49% seems like it's maybe let's get to 50% of participants. Brilliant. Okay. So if I'm just going to end the poll, thank you for answering. So most of you responded with the 40 to 49%, with 50 to 59, 60 to 69, 70 to 79 gap also following the response. So thank you for sharing that. So actually it is 71% of companies in the S&P 1200 have operations that are overlapping with KBA. So a lot more than that 50% kind of that a majority of you were highlighting. So, it does feel like quite a significant value when we talk about that over 50%. So thinking about the impact also goes hand in hand with considering the dependency side of it as well. Oh, sorry, one second. Yeah. So on the dependency side, so maybe kind of remind ourselves what dependency really focuses on is that it's really looking at the interaction between the level of reliance as well as reliance on the ecosystem services and kind of companies' operations, but also the ability of the ecosystem to be able to keep and continue and sustain that flow of services. And yes, of course, everyone is dependent on nature. But here, what we're trying to highlight is that 57%, again, referring to the S&P 1200 studies, of some of the world's largest companies face significant dependencies on risk and nature across their direct operations. So where we define dependency risks as the combination of high dependency on nature, on ecosystem service at risk. So from this, given the critical nature of these dependencies, you have to start asking, why are so many companies still falling short when it comes to their commitments to biodiversity? So in this slide, according to the latest S&P corporate sustainability assessment, which we call the CSA, the majority of companies worldwide do not have public biodiversity policies or commitments, which obviously kind of factors in that response to that. So this gap is especially kind of pronounced outside of leading regions and sectors, so with significant variations across those geographic and industries, which we're seeing on this slide. So, for example, what's highlighted on the left-hand side of the slide is that Latin America and Africa have kind of the highest share of companies with biodiversity commitments, while other regions, maybe like the Middle East and North America, are kind of lagging behind. On the other side, when we're looking at the sector assessment, we're looking at, okay, utilities and energy sectors that are more likely to have policies in place, but most other sectors kind of remain far less engaged from that. So overall, only about a quarter of companies globally undertaking the CSA, the Corporate Sustainability Assessment, have made biodiversity a formal part of their sustainability strategy. So with the conversation of biodiversity, we know that climate also impacts ESG scores, but also biodiversity does also have an impact. It does have that significant impact on where we're focusing on ESG, which is the environmental, social, and governance scores, as they are integral kind of components of the environmental criteria for within the ESG framework. So as we highlight here for the environment score, we're considering things like climate strategy, water, sustainable raw materials, energy, but also biodiversity is one of kind of the core metrics that filter into this as well. Now, these ESG scores reflect a company's environmental performance, risk management capabilities, and also commitments to sustainability. So organizations that really kind of help prioritize biodiversity are better positioned to enhance those kind of ESG ratings and meet the growing expectations for kind of both investors and stakeholders as well. And just a quick slide to kind of summarize that kind of the perspective that we've spoken about. So increasing relevance of nature for capital markets. When we talk about that climate transition, it is and also inevitably linked to kind of nature and biodiversity. And companies that are directly exposed to nature related, they are both exposed to nature related impacts and dependencies. But also to start considering that not all companies are fully prepared for this and for these risks and opportunities as well. And then that final point, which we just covered, is talking about those ESG scores, although it covers kind of a variety of different components for transparency and performance. They do also consider things like biodiversity as well. So happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to pop them in the chat and I will be here responding to them as well. So yeah, I will pass it back over, I think, to Fiona or London.
Yep, you got it. Thanks so much, Valentina, and thanks again for joining us and that really helpful overview of some of the good work that S&P Global is doing. And with that, we want to now take a moment to finish up our first module, and we'll recap on a few points we've covered so far, hopefully just to maybe re-ingrain them as we move along or before we move along. So the first is quite simple, and that's every business depends on nature in some way or fashion. This isn't just about farming or resource extraction, where of course we naturally right away think about nature, but we've shown that all sectors and regions of our economy and society rely on nature in some way or fashion. The bottom line is because of this universal dependence, nature is a topic that every single organization needs to understand and seriously address. Next, hopefully you'll now understand that nature is not an isolated issue. We've highlighted that it's strongly interconnected with other societal issues, and nature-related risks can easily connect to and amplify other major corporate risks, making the global risk landscape highly complex. The next I want to mention is location, location, location. So your exposure to nature-related dependencies, risks, and opportunities is highly dependent on where you operate, your geographic footprint and your specific sector, as well as your value chain and where your value chain is located. And finally, as S&P1 and Valentina just noted with us, investors are increasingly recognizing the financial materiality of nature-related issues and factoring it into their decision-making. And this is leading to greater demand for disclosure from companies via investor demand. So hopefully now we're feeling a bit refreshed and we understand the core concepts from Module 1. And with that, we're going to move more into some additional content for today's workshop. So I'll turn it over to Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Landon. And that brings us then to our next module. And here we'll move on to considering the frameworks and guidance that are available to support companies in making nature-related disclosures. So in order to do this, we will be looking at three key concepts in this unit. The first will introduce the TNFD and its adoption by the market. Once we cover that, we'll also discuss how to make use of the recommendations and guidance developed by the TNFD. And finally, we'll explore how the TNFD then aligns and supports other reporting standards and frameworks. And I've already seen some questions about that, so glad we'll get to dive into that. So to begin with the first focus of today, what is the TNFD? Who better to answer that than our TNFD team? So TJ, thanks for being here with us, and I pass over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks to the NSE team for hosting this session today. So actually, I was just thinking, how do I start the conversation? why TNFD was created and what do we do, what do we really do, I thought I'll just give you a quick context apart from everything what was already spoken. Um, and there was a question on asking some real life examples. So I have two examples which I want to share with you before I get into this why TNFD was created. And one of the examples is really on Taiwan. So we all use ChatGPT, Claude, and data centers. Uh, and all these everything all these AI is at the back of it. It's um, uh, Taiwan is producing these semiconductors which are used for AI, right? Supplying microchips for computers, mobile phones, as well as car sensors. And this microchip production is heavily reliant on water, right? Water use. So a typical manufacturing plant in Taiwan uses about 7 to 15 million liters of ultra pure water to manufacture these chips, right? So in 2021, what happened in Taiwan was they had this massive drought. And Taiwan really relies on that water sourcing from monsoons, from their from monsoons which are happening in Taiwan. They rely on that water. So because there was a drought, they couldn't get that rainwater, so they had to source water from water tankers, right? And what did that create? That create supply chain issues. That created issues on manufacturing for microchips and semiconductors, right? Because they could not fulfill that demand of water, and because of that, the production fell by 7% in Taiwan in 2021. It's public news. And because of that production, which fell by 7%, a specific company faced a loss of 500 million US dollars just because they did not manage their water risk correctly. Right? So this is one of the examples how TNFD's approach and TNFD's framework could be useful for organizations to understand their dependencies on water. So in this case, dependency on water, but dependency on natural habitat. Then the other example I wanted to mention, I just want to mention two examples before I get into it. So the other example I want to mention is really one of these really big companies, and you must have heard about on Tesla, right? So Tesla produces these EV cars, and we know it's a massive company, right? So they created this gigafactory in Berlin, in Brandenburg in Berlin. And what happened when they created this factory was they started manufacturing EV cars there. So every now Tesla car uses about 2,000 or to 2,500 liters of water for that to manufacture one car of Tesla. Similarly, in India, I'm sure manufacturers use a lot of water to manufacture these cars. So what happened in that specific area in Brandenburg, that specific area was already under water stress, right? So the environmentalist and conservational groups, they started protesting against Tesla, specifically because on their water usage, right? So overnight, when the complaints were happening, overnight, Tesla's share price dropped by 3.1% just because they did not manage their water risk correctively at that moment, right? So these are two real world examples which are in front of you for you to understand why TNFD is so important, because the framework and the guidance which TNFD gives you is to understand your dependencies and impacts and risk and opportunities, right? Having said that, our disclosure recommendations and guidance are basically to move the capital from negative cash flows to positive cash flows, right? From negative outcomes to nature positive outcomes. And the framework which I've been talking about, and everyone in the meeting is talking about, is the LEAP framework methodology and the disclosure recommendations. And this was created by a group of task force and science-based task force and our partners and standard bodies. Right. This was also reviewed by them, as I mentioned, the top of the financial institutions and corporates who helped us create this recommended disclosures and guidance, as you can see on the screen. And that is why TNFD is so essential, specifically to understand your nature-related dependencies and impacts, and risk as well, and to create more opportunities once you've done that. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the TNFD recommendations are designed for organizations to use them and for firstly to use them to understand your dependencies and impacts, and then let investors know and other stakeholders know that specific stakeholder sustainability information. And the reason that information is important is because that is one of the reasons your organization is going to get more investment and is going to be more stakeholder friendly for investors, right? And the other reason it is important is it is to for your own organization to understand your dependencies and impacts and how to mitigate those dependencies. So for example, in this Tesla's example or in Taiwan example, if they would have just managed those water risk correctively, right? If they would have mitigated that water risk, they would have not faced that 500 million US dollar loss or a 3.1% share price drop if they would have just managed it correctly. And so that is the relevance of these TNFD guidance and recommendations. Next slide, please. So before we go a bit more detail in what is TNFD and what is this guidance I'm talking about, today we have more than 750 organizations who have adopted the TNFD framework. Specifically in India, we have more than 29 organizations who have adopted the framework. We have Tata Steel, Tata Power, ITC Group. We have JSW Steel, Harshal. You've heard him talking. We have Cipla. We have Glenmark Pharmaceuticals. They've all adopted the framework. They're all working to understand their dependencies and impacts. Globally, we have more than 800 reports now, which are available with companies who are reporting against the TNFD framework. In India, we have more than 10 reports, integrated reports on climate and nature together. And that is the reason why companies are reporting, because they understand the importance of it through the stakeholders and through the investors, and why investors are seeking that information. On an average, a company is reporting on 8 of the 14 recommended disclosures, which is already quite a massive leap if you compare it to TCFD. When TCFD started, companies were reporting against 1 or 2 recommended disclosures. And we also surveyed the asset managers and asset owners, and 77 of them said that we want nature as a standard. And that is why you will hear, I will also update you that how we are working with ISSB so closely to incorporate that. Specifically in India, I want to mention that, as you know, as Vinita also mentioned, that TNFD has worked with CII, IBBI to create a TNFD BRSR interoperability mapping, which basically means that if your organization is already reporting against BRSR, you don't need to start doing more work on TNFD. All you need to do is open the mapping and understand what aligns with BRSR and TNFD together, because a lot of the nature already includes in BRSR, is already included in BRSR. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. Am I covering that, Tiffany, or is you covering it?
No, I think it's back to me now for the next section.
Okay.
Thank you so much, TJ. Great. So sorry, I was answering some questions in the Q&A. We have them coming in hard and thick now. So TJ, if you can also help out with some questions in the Q&A, that would be great. Thanks for that great overview. And now, since this module is about making use of global standards to keep you really on the right track, let's take a bit of time to walk through what you have as guidance and how you can use the TNFD recommendations and guidelines so that you can all leave this webinar knowing what resources you have at your disposal. So that brings us to another poll. And in this one, we'd like to know how many of you are already familiar with or making use of the TNFD's materials. Give me 2 seconds here and I can... Oh, it's up already. Sorry. The poll's there. Great. So are you already reporting on nature? Are you familiar with the TNFD recommendations, but you haven't reported on them yet? Are you not using or planning to use the TNFD recommended guidance, or are you unsure? All answers are correct. We just want to get a sense where you are now. And they're anonymous, so you don't have to worry about sharing anything that you think we might then come back to you on. Great. So very interesting answers so far. More than half of you have shared your response. I'll give you 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. We're going to share the results now. So actually, almost half of you are not using the TNFD recommendations and guidance. Also, feel free to share in the chat why not. Maybe there's some sort of barrier that's stopping you, and we'd love to hear from you as to why not. But a lot of you actually already are. 25% of you are already reporting on nature. Congratulations. 25, about a quarter of you are starting that journey, are on your way. So some of you don't know, so which is totally okay too. So hopefully we can continue that journey and help you understand how to take those next steps now. Great. So I think to get started with, it's important to be very clear that the TNFD is not simply 14 recommended disclosures, which is what we normally hear about. So before walking through the recommended disclosures that many might have heard of, we firstly wanted to explore how the conceptual foundations of the TNFD, alongside its 6 general disclosure requirements, informed those 14 recommended disclosures and how these all work together. I know that's a lot of numbers, so let's take it one at a time. So first, let's start with the conceptual foundations, which are important to keep in mind when thinking about adopting the TNFD recommendations, as they help to clarify what is the purpose and the ambition of these disclosures. So first, we have materiality basis. This means organizations should disclose material information about their nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. But what do we mean by material? So that's the second conceptual foundation here, which speaks to materiality approaches. So materiality is really actually a big topic on its own. And don't worry, because we will discuss this a little bit later today and answer any questions that you have on this topic. But what I think is important to highlight from the start is that the TNFD recognizes that there are different approaches to materiality. And the recommendations have been designed to accommodate these different forms of materiality preferences and requirements through a range of report disclosure guidelines. The next conceptual foundation is comprehensiveness in identification and assessment of nature-related issues. So the TNFD strongly recommends the identification and assessment of all 4 types of nature-related issues: dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, or DIROs, as you might hear us say. Remember, this harks back to that diagram we saw where in nature we see the risks and dependencies, and then in businesses we see the risks and the impacts. So we need to think about how those all impact each other in that cycle. So finally, it's recommended that you start even at a basic level on all 4 of these, and then increase the breadth and depth of disclosure ambition over time. This is, of course, consistent with both the ISSB and the GRI standards and the global policy goals and targets of the global biodiversity framework, which we talked about in our initial module, the video. Great. Next, let's look at the 6 general requirements. These build on and create a base. They build on the 4 conceptual foundations, and they create a base then for the 14 disclosure recommendations. They include materiality, scope, location, integration, time horizons, and engagement. And then these 6 general disclosure requirements go together with the 14 voluntary recommended disclosures. And those are grouped in 4 categories: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. So just keeping in mind the structure there, let's now go into exploring further the TNFD's general requirements, which, as the diagram shows, are intended to be applied to all of the recommended disclosures. So let's take a look at those in a little bit more detail here. So the purpose of the general requirements is to enable consistency and comparability across reports. They also allow report preparers to communicate to report users essential context needed to correctly interpret nature-related issues. The TNFD includes 6 general requirements, which sit in addition to the general requirements of the ISSB's IFRS S1 standard. So if an organization chooses to state publicly that it is using or aligning with the TNFD recommendations, it's expected to apply these 6 TNFD requirements as well as the 5 ISSB general requirements to ensure that information is disclosed in a clear, consistent, and decision-useful way. So let's just quickly go through these. The first is application of materiality. So organizations need to explain how they determine which nature-related issues are material. In other words, which issues could meaningfully influence their business decisions, performance, or stakeholders. Then is scope of disclosure. So this is about dealing with the boundaries of what is being reported. For example, which business units, geographies, value chain stages, or assets are included. Third is location of nature-related issues. So the focus here is where in the business nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities occur, such as specific sites in their supply chain or their product lines. Fourth is the integration with other sustainability-related disclosures. So TNFD is actually designed to work alongside other frameworks like the ISSB or GRI and jurisdictional standards as well. So organizations should explain how their nature-related disclosure connect with their broader sustainability reporting. The fifth general requirement is time horizons. So that means that companies need to describe the short, medium, and long-term timeframes that are used to assess nature-related risks and opportunities and why those timeframes are relevant. And then finally, engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. So this requirement recognizes that people closest to nature often hold essential knowledge and are the most affected by nature-related decisions. So organizations are expected to describe how they engage with these groups in a meaningful and cultural way. So all these requirements related to your disclosure really set the scene for the 14 recommended disclosures, and they help put the context in place. Great. So with that, let's go through the 14 recommended disclosures, and we're going to do that first at a high level, then we're going to look at a few examples and see what that looks like. So let's briefly walk through each pillar. Remember, there were 4 kind of pillars or categories of disclosure. First is governance. This pillar focuses on how the organization is governed with respect to nature. So it includes disclosures on board oversight, on management, and on engagement. The second here is on strategy, and the organization explains in this pillar how nature affects its business model and its strategy. The third is risk and impact management, and this pillar describes the processes the organization uses to identify, to assess, to prioritize, and to monitor nature-related issues. And then finally, we have metrics and targets, and this recommended area has companies disclose exactly what it says, the metrics and the targets they use to measure and manage nature-related issues. So this pillar shows how performance is being tracked and managed over time. So together, the 14 individual disclosures, and I know it's a bit small on this slide, but you can see there's an A, B, C, and sometimes a D underneath each of those pillars. Those are your 14 disclosures. They each should be employed with the general requirements, so that context we just talked through. Now, I think the easiest here to look at these individual disclosures is to look at some examples and how this is being done in practice. So we're going to take an example at a time to look at each of these. We're going to start with governance, how nature is governed. And this example is from Swire Properties, their 2024 climate and nature-related financial disclosures, to see how some organizations are approaching the TNFD governance recommendations in practice. Quick disclaimer, remember that all the examples we're using in our workshop are simply examples of real life practices. So we're not endorsing them or the companies that develop these reports. And recognize that each company will be different. They'll be at different stages of their nature journey, and they'll have different contexts. So just because one company does it one way doesn't mean it's the perfect way for every other company to do it. So under the TNFD's governance pillar, there's 3 things that a company is asked to describe. The first is the board's oversight of nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. The second is management's role in assessing and managing these issues. And the third is relevant human rights policies and engagement activities, including oversight of engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. So in this example, we can see several of these components. First, they outline how the board of directors sets and approves strategic direction on sustainability matters, including climate and nature-related issues. Next, the disclosure sets out the role of the ESG steering committee and various working groups, showing how management reviews risks, develops strategy, and monitors progress against KPIs related to climate and nature. And finally, the example shows several policies which together indicate the organization's stated commitments and frameworks that support engagement and oversight. So as you can see here, they have clearly stated their policies on, we have here biodiversity, on water, on resources and circularity, and also on human rights as well. It's important to see this here too as a reminder that governance C, the third governance recommendation, is on human rights policies and engagement activities. Now, just to note, we have included in the slide deck, the handout that you have available, another example for governance, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move to our next example in strategy. And here we can see how a few companies are disclosing information about the effects of nature-related issues on their business model, strategy, and financial planning. So just as a reminder here, the TNFD strategy pillar has organizations asked to describe four main things. The first being nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, or DIROs, that have been identified over the short, medium, and long term. The second is the effects that those DIROs have on the organization's business model, value chain, strategy, and financial planning, as well as any transition plans or analysis being used to determine those effects. The third is the resilience of the organization's strategy vis-a-vis these DIROs when considering different scenarios. And finally, the fourth is the location of assets or activities that are considered priority locations. So the first example here is from a financial institution called Robeco. Robeco is a pure play global asset manager and a leader in sustainable investing based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. And as you can see on this slide, we'll just make that a bit bigger there. They have provided in their integrated annual report two donut graphs illustrating the amount of assets under management in their portfolio that have a high or very high impact or dependency on biodiversity. So this speaks to strategy A, the first component, as it shows to some extent the dependencies and impacts identified in their portfolio. This also, however, sets the scene for the second image that you see here. We'll make that one a little bit bigger for you there, which shows the main steps to their biodiversity investment framework. As you can see in this framework, Robeco illustrates how it evaluates how well companies are addressing biodiversity loss and differentiates leaders and laggards. Furthermore, they have indicated in their report that starting in 2024, they're using this framework to guide their investment decision-making. In another section of the report, they also indicate that their strategy aims to leverage a shift towards nature-positive world through their biodiversity fund, which focuses on sustainable forestry and sustainable food systems, pollution reduction, and ecosystem restoration. So this speaks to an extent also to strategy component B, which wants you to understand how the impacts and dependencies influence the company strategy. We've also included a few extra examples in your handout on strategy, but I'm going to now move on to risk management. Great, so our next example comes from AMEA Power's 2024 TNFD report. And this one here helps us to see what it might look like to see content related to risk and impact management. So AMEA Power is a solar technology and project developer in the UAE. Now, under the TNFD's risk and impact management pillar, organizations are asked to describe three things. First, A is the process used to identify, assess, and prioritize DIROs, both in the company's direct operations as well as in its upstream and downstream value chain. So remember, that's identify, assess, and prioritize. Then B is the process for managing DIROs, and C is how these processes are integrated into and inform the overall risk management process of the company. So as you may have noticed, if you can read on this slide, this section is all about processes, how our risk management unfolds. Because of this, we often see a narrative description here as all these processes are described here. So this table from EMEA Power is quite useful to see a quick summary of the risks, implications, and management of risks, as well as identification of opportunities. So as you may remember from our example on strategy, it is in the strategy pillar where we have disclosure recommendations related to the identification of and the effects of nature-related risks. But here we also have the management and mitigation of those risks, providing real examples to add color to the process the company describes. So for example, we can see in this table that the company conducts a biodiversity action plan to protect and restore habitats to mitigate the risk impact on threatened species. Great, so let's now look at an example for metrics and targets. We're going to stick with the same company here. Pardon me. But under the TNFD's metrics and targets pillar, organizations are asked to describe three main things. A, the metrics used to assess and manage nature-related risks and opportunities. So A is metrics. B, the metrics used to manage nature-related dependency and impacts. So we have metrics on risks and opportunities, metrics on nature-related risks or dependencies and impacts. Then third is C is targets used to manage and measure performance on nature. So what you're seeing on your screen here is a continuation of the last example from EMEA Power and a table that they have used to list the metrics they are using. As you can see here, we have some metrics that are under review, others that have been provided. But I think what's important to indicate here is that this table like this is not enough alone. What we need to also see is how these then connect back to the dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities identified. What was the starting point for this metric? Where do we aim to be? And how are we doing working towards our targets? We want to make sure that what we measure is it matters. Now, before we move on, I just want to flag one more example. This is in your handout, so I'll leave you to look at it in more detail. But for all the disclosures we discussed today, understanding the time horizons we're working with is essential. And like the company has done here, these time horizons should make sense for your business cycle and supply chain. So this company used 0 to 3 years as short term, 3 to 10 for medium, and 10 plus for long term. But others will use different horizons. So the importance is why you choose those horizons and that you disclose what they are. So I'll leave that one with you to discover on your own time, but just to flag that it's really important that that's something that's thought through internally. Great, so now that we've done a quick overview of those 14 recommended disclosures and the 16 general requirements and looked at some examples of what it might look like in practice, I think we should take a minute to look at the additional guidance that TNFD provides to support organizations in disclosing these recommended disclosures. So let's start first with the sector and biome guidance. So the TNFD recognizes that nature is indeed complex and that the way nature affects an organization can vary hugely depending on the sector they're operating in and the biome is the location. So because of this nuance, TNFD offers sector-specific guidance. So for example, for the financial institutions, beverages, metal and mining, and many other sectors. Importantly, this guidance is designed to be flexible and practical. So organizations only need to review and use the parts that are relevant for their own industry or their own practices. So TNFD also provides biome-specific guidance. Now, a biome is simply a major type of natural environment, such as forests or grasslands or rivers or coastal zones, and each with its own ecological characteristics. So this helps organizations interpret nature-related issues depending on where their operations and value chains are in nature. So if you're just getting started, this is a really great way to start. You already know where you're located and what are the main biomes you're located in, and you know what industry you're in. So you can use these guidance to start understanding your interaction with nature. Now, some other great guidance you have here is the material that supports the full set of recommendations, including guidance on the LEAP approach, which TJ mentioned. We'll go into much more depth into this in our next module. But LEAP is a practical step-by-step method that TNFD has developed to help organizations do that identification, assessment, prioritization of nature-related issues. There's also guidance on value chains and on engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. And we'll explore those later in our fourth chapter today. Now, also, there are specific guidance on certain pillars, such as there's scenario analysis guidance, which supports strategy disclosures by helping organizations explore how different nature futures could affect their business. And there's also metrics and targets guidance, including sector metrics and information on setting science-based targets for nature. So altogether, this package of additional guidance is designed to help organizations move from simply disclosing information to actually managing nature-related risks and opportunities in a structured and forward-looking way. Now, I want to take just a minute to talk about engagement. So while TNFD builds on the IFRS's S1 and S2 standards, one notable addition is its focus on the importance of engagement with Indigenous peoples and local communities and affected stakeholders. So the TNFD's general requirements and recommended disclosures ask that organizations describe the process they use for engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected and other stakeholders in their assessment of and response to nature-related issues, and also their human rights policies and engagement activities and oversight of these provided by the board and management. The TNFD, therefore, has dedicated guidance on engagement to support organizations which aim to provide practical information and support to organizations. And this is a really helpful tool that you can use when you start that engagement. You can find more information on this in the TNFD Knowledge Hub. I highly recommend you use that. But I'm going to move now to our next video, and let's hear from Harshal on how he finds benefits from this.
We are now focusing on quantifying positive or negative impact of our interaction on nature. And currently we are exploring how do we build the cost associated with this positive or negative impact while making investment decisions. So we are trying to put a number, financial number, in terms of the positive or negative impact on nature. So consider the internal carbon price. So we are trying to put or develop similar kind of structure to consider this nature related cost in the investment decisions.
Great. And with that, I'm going to pass over to TJ, who's going to look at the TNFD and the broader landscape of disclosure guidance. Over to you, TJ.
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide, please?
Just to highlight, TJ, you should have control at the bottom of the screen on the slides.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So as I just basically went through all the TNFD, why TNFD was created, and I think Harshal gave a very realistic example of how this is being implemented in India. I would really recommend you to all go and download JSW's report. It should be available online. It's a very, very interesting report and very, very practical approach to how companies are reporting against the TNFD framework. So as I mentioned, the TNFD is not a standard setup, but how we are set up in a broader landscape. I want to just take you through that. So on top or on the left-hand side, we have the Global Biodiversity Framework, and we have the Paris Agreement. Then we cascade it down to the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, SPTN, which are the international frameworks and guidance. Then we further cascade it down to the GRI, IFRS. As you know that some jurisdictions, they use IFRS. A lot of companies in India, they also report against the GRI framework. So that's how it cascades it down to GRI and ISSB. And then we have further market regulation for specific countries. For example, in India, where we have BRSR, right? And the reason this is important is because TNFD is not trying to duplicate things with other standards and frameworks, right? We want other standards and standards be mostly to leverage TNFD for organizations to report against that framework. So we want to avoid duplication of work. So as I also mentioned, we made significant effort to work around a different interoperability towards with TNFD. So one example I want to give you, which is not mentioned here, is the BRSR TNFD alignment mapping. I have pasted the link of that mapping in the Q&A section, but I will also paste it on the chat. And that is the most relevant for India. And basically what that document does is, if you're reporting against the BRSR framework, that will tell you that, okay, these are my points which I'm reporting against in the BRSR. This aligns with the TNFD framework. So that is how I am aligned to the TNFD framework, right? So this is around the framework. This is around the reporting side. But how do you get to that reporting is through that LEAP approach, the locate, evaluate, assess, prepare approach, which I will come to in a few slides. Right? So this is how this is structured. Similarly, we have done it in Europe with ESRS, and we are now working with ISSB to incorporate TNFD within the ISSB framework. And as you may know, that ISSB have announced that they will develop a practice statement, and their proposed form of standard setting on nature would be a practice statement, which basically means that ISSB wants to give time to organizations for them to understand nature before they start reporting on nature, right? This is also a way for ISSB to kind of give a statement that they have recognized TNFD, and this is how things will evolve when it has been incorporated within ISSB. I was in Philippines, Indonesia, and Singapore last month. They're all following ISSB, and similarly, organizations who have already advanced on climate, they've started to work around nature already. Right. So the earlier you start, the better it is, because there is a lot of investor movement to understand your nature-based risks. There is also, and more than investor movement, I would say there is a lot of it is important and beneficial for your own organization to understand the dependencies and impacts on nature, and also stay ahead of the regulations which are going to come in the future. Right. So because of all these reasons, TNFD has created these documents, like interoperability documents, for organizations to report against these frameworks and avoid duplication as we move forward. So specifically in India, on this BRSR TNFD alignment document, I will share a link here for you to go through that. Just I want to give a quick overview of alignment of the TNFD with ISSB and TCFD. I've already given an overview of how we are structured, but ultimately all this guidance is available on the TNFD website. Right? And all the TNFD guidance has been structurally aligned with the ISSB guidance, and in the same sort of methodology. Right? Because as I mentioned earlier, we do not want to create duplication of work. We want to make sure that we align ourselves. We want to make sure we want to align ourselves with the international frameworks available. Right? So again, I will share a link of the BRSR TNFD alignment document. So please go through that document, and it is highly relevant for India. The other highly relevant document is the GRI 101. I know a lot of organizations also use GRI 101. So that interoperability document is also available on the TNFD website. So please download that document. So if your organization is reporting against GRI 101, then you can use that interoperability mapping to also report against the TNFD framework. Um, Then, as I mentioned, ISSB has announced that they will develop a practice statement for nature-related disclosures. This is for organizations to start their work around nature as things mature. So I think I've already explained that, so I will not repeat it. Um, um, I will not go through the ESRS, not relevant. So on the GRI one, as I already mentioned, this document is available on the TNFD website. Please download the document. And if you're already helping your organization to report against GRI 101, uh, please use that. And if your organization have European operations, you can also use the ESRS document, which was in the previous slide. It's the approach is similar. It is interoperability mapping with the ESRS, and the GRI one is the interoperability mapping with the GRI 101. Yeah, this is also I kind of explained already. The TNFD's approach is to be flexible and to avoid any duplication of work. So we want you to leverage whatever is already available in the market so that you can use our interoperability mapping in that order. And we satisfy different materiality approaches, which is double materiality as well as single materiality.
Great. Thanks so much, TJ. That gives us a really good overview of interoperability and takes us to our key takeaways. So just before we wrap up this unit, I wanted to highlight 3 key takeaways. The first is that TNFD provides a roadmap. They've developed a clear set of disclosure recommendations and supporting guidance. So please make use of all of that. And you can come back to this recording to be reminded of all of the many resources available. Secondly, there is a wealth of supporting material around that framework. So the TNFD has developed an extensive range of resources to support adoption across every sector and geography. So don't feel overwhelmed. It's a lot of content, but it's designed to be used flexibly and as you need it. Finally, the TNFD is designed to fit your existing reporting. So it was developed to be applied flexibly and in combination with other major reporting standards and frameworks. So don't consider this, totally separate from all of those, but rather look at how they work together. Now, I'm just checking time. We only have 1 minute for Q&A, which was here. Luckily, our team has been answering all your questions in the Q&A. But maybe, TJ, if I can just come to you to provide a little bit more context on 2 of the questions that I've seen here that have repeated a little bit. One of them is really taking into the local context, so the connection with BRSR. How are you seeing that connection happening in the market? Given you were just speaking at an event in NSE recently, maybe you can kind of provide a bit more context to what's happening locally in India.
Yes. So but on that document itself, so that document was when the document was created, we consulted on that document with 30 of the big corporates in India, including JSW Steel and ITC Group and Tata Power. So they've already understood that document, consulted on the document, and are using this document. Right. So organizations who are reporting against BRSR are already using this sort of document to also report against the TNFD framework. Now, there's a question that if you're already reporting against BRSR, why do you have to do on TNFD? The answer to that question is very simple, that BRSR is recognized in India, right? If you have specifically to understand your nature-related dependencies and impacts, TNFD goes a bit more deeper in terms of metrics and architecture, right? And metrics and measurement architecture. So it will give you a deeper understanding of what your nature-based risks are, number 1. Number 2, if you have international investors, right, they will understand a standard language of framework, which is at the moment for nature is TNFD. So you will have a specific leverage with international investors if you start working around TNFD, right? Third, I mean, if you're already reporting as BRSR, you don't have to duplicate work any which way, because that document is specifically created for you to help against to avoid duplication.
Thanks so much, TJ. That actually brings us right to time. So I'm going to give everyone a well-deserved 10-minute break. Please go grab a drink, have a quick stretch, and come back for the next half of our workshop. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, and with that bell or chime, we'll get started again. I hope you had a minute or enough time to grab a cup of tea or a cup of coffee to help power you through the second half. And with that, we'll get started with Module 3 on Implement. Up until now, we've outlined the TNFD recommendations and guidance and how they can support companies in identifying, assessing, and managing those nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So now we're going to move on and look a bit more practically at how this is done, starting with the practices and processes needed to conduct your assessment of nature-related issues. So we'll take just a quick second to break down this unit. We're going to cover 3 topics that are key to progressing action on nature, considering where to start in assessing nature-related issues. Then we'll delve into TNFD's LEAP approach that can support this. I'm sure you're at this point a bit more curious, what is LEAP? We've mentioned it a few times. And then we'll finish with a practice case study exercise from S&P to bring this to life and hopefully show you a real world example. To kick us off on this unit, let's firstly look at the steps organizations may wish to take at the outset when they're getting started with nature and nature disclosure. First, let's look at understanding a bit better what it means to embed nature into an organization's processes. To successfully embed nature into our corporate processes, we must begin by changing our mindset. The starting point needs to be a clear understanding that nature is essential to your business. It's not just an environmental concern, it underpins everything from supply chains to your long-term stability. Once we acknowledge that fundamental importance of nature, we need to get a bit more granular and then delve deeper into what the specific dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities are that truly affect our organizations. So what exactly do we rely on? Where are we having an effect? And where do the resulting risks and opportunities lie? These critical insights cannot just sit on a shelf and collect dust. The next step is non-negotiable. These findings will need to be integrated into our existing risk management and strategy development processes. And if a nature risk is material, it must inform the strategy just in the way a financial or a market risk would impact or inform our strategy. To achieve this integration, we need broad buy-in and action. An organization-wide approach is absolutely required. And I want to be clear here that this is not just a sustainability issue. It involves finance, operations, product design, and procurement. Therefore, we need to identify all the teams and business areas that need to contribute to this work and also own the outcomes across the company and supply chains. Finally, successful execution requires structure and accountability. We must establish initial governance over nature to help guide and drive these actions consistently throughout the business. This governance structure is what will ensure we move from assessment to impactful, lasting change. So the disclosures and actions you eventually report are really just the tip of the iceberg you see here in the diagram. And then the crucial foundational work we've just discussed under the surface, the identification, integration, governance, and organization-wide engagement is the massive amount of work hidden beneath the water. And that makes the public-facing success possible. To get started on this, it's really important to bring together the right people from throughout the organization. As we just mentioned, it requires kind of an all of organization buy-in with a number of teams and operations taking place. This can sometimes be a challenge. So let's hear again from our market voice, Harshal here, regarding how they approached this issue and tackling this.
I think the most important lesson for us is to use the language which operational team understands. for them to see the value in this whole exercise. How this whole TNFD framework is going to help us run our plants better, avoid maybe future pains, um, uh, should be the language we should try and speak. Now, for example, asking simple questions like, what can we, what can stop our production lines, or what causes community complaints, or what causes legal notices, or what has caused delay in getting the approval for our expansion project, etc. I think uh, these kind of conversation will help us to get more insights from the employees and the stakeholders who we are involving for this whole framework implementation.
Okay, apologies. I just had a bit of a lag there. But next, we have another poll. How familiar are you with TNFD's LEAP approach? So perhaps you or your organization are using it already. Maybe you're not using it yet, but you're familiar with it, say before this session, or maybe you're still at the stage where you haven't heard of it. So I want to let you have a few seconds to fill that in. And in the meantime, I think it was very helpful to hear how they were in the video, they were finding, excuse me, how in the video they were finding some great ways to engage their colleagues throughout the organization on this topic, and getting together an internal assessment team is part of the scoping exercise that TNFD recommends to kick off the LEAP approach, which we'll take you through in a moment. Before we do, let's take a look at the results now. If you give me 1 second. Oh, there we go. Apologies. I had lost it. So we see now only about 8% are using the TNFD LEAP approach currently. So hopefully that changes after today. And then 50% are not using it yet, but at least that 50% is familiar with it. Again, hopefully after today, all of you are able to implement it. And 42% have not heard of it yet. So thankfully, after today, you'll have heard of it and be much more familiar. Okay. So there's not a wrong answer here, but again, after today, hopefully you're much better prepared and able to start utilizing it. Now, with that, how do you go about utilizing it and getting started? So the first and most crucial step to successfully integrating nature into your organization is, of course, getting a clear understanding of the nature-related issues that are relevant and material to your business. So with that, the TNFD recommends using the LEAP approach as the starting point to build this understanding. So it's designed to be flexible and iterative, meaning you can adapt it and build on your insights over time. It doesn't have to be absolutely concrete and then, not change for the next 5 reporting cycles. Now, what is the LEAP approach? Well, it's the TNFD's methodology for the identification and assessment of nature-related issues. It provides structured guidance across 4 phases to help you understand your organization's nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And it's designed to be used by an internal project team within your organization to conduct an assessment of the issues. So after an initial scoping exercise, LEAP proceeds through its 4 key or core phases. First, the L in LEAP, where you locate your organization's interface with nature. So where do your operations, value chain, and other activities interact with ecosystems? Then the E, evaluate your dependencies on and impacts on nature. So how does nature support your business, and how does your business affect nature? Next, the A, assess your nature-related risks and opportunities that arise from these dependencies and impacts. And then, of course, prepare to respond to and report on your material nature-related issues aligning with the TNFD's recommended disclosures that Tiffany took you through previously. So LEAP builds on existing frameworks like the Natural Capital Protocol and the Science-Based Network, or SBTN methods, which perhaps you're familiar with already. We touched, apologies. Was having some issues, but okay, there we go. So engagement is an important cross-cutting component of the LEAP approach, informing all phases, and the complex interplay between an organization's own dependencies and impacts and those of others in society really underscores the need for engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders across corporate value chains. And if you're already familiar with a nature assessment process, you can also use LEAP as a checklist to ensure it aligns with the TNFD's recommended disclosures. And perhaps most crucially, you don't have to disclose everything identified through LEAP. When it comes time for your disclosure, you'll apply your chosen materiality approach. And then we're going to go back to our market voice, Harshal, and let's hear now from Harshal about his organization's experience using the LEAP approach.
So before engaging with TNFD recommendations and LEAP approach, we primarily viewed nature-related risks through a compliance and operational lens, such as water availability, land acquisition, and environment clearances. While these risks were managed individually, the broader dependencies on surrounding ecosystem were not fully assessed in integrated and forward-looking manner. So a key blind spot identified during this whole LEAP process was our dependency on shared water resources and land ecosystem beyond plant and our mine boundaries, and that too particularly when we have our operations in water stress region. So this whole LEAP structured approach help map against sensitive watersheds, forest areas, biodiversity hotspots around our operations, and thereby revealing how ecosystem degradation can directly impact our resilience, so to say. And by shifting focus from impacts, which was the case earlier, we are integrating dependency, risk, and opportunities through TNFD and translating nature-related issues into business-relevant risk, I think, and then strengthening our enterprise risk management program and learning how do we allocate capital and decision making, keeping in view the nature related risk.
Great. So hopefully that's helpful as well to see the practicality of it and this LEAP in practice. We see companies are finding real value out of this approach. But with that, you might still be wondering how exactly you can use the LEAP approach. So I'm going to pass over to Fiona as well as TJ now to take you through an activity to help you flesh that out a little bit more.
Great, thanks so much for that, Landon. A great overview. So we're now going to move in now to explaining a bit more about what LEAP is and how companies can practically start to use it to build their nature understanding. So to do that, we're going to move back into Mentimeter, which we used at the start of the session. So I've shared the link in the chat with you already to join us in Menti, and let me just share my screen now as well. As a reminder, you can either click the link in the chat, which is available to you already. You can also go to menti.com and enter that 8-number code that you're seeing at the top of the screen there. But what we're going to do in our next section now for 20 minutes or so is work through a practical example of how a company uses Leap. We're going to take a simplified approach to this. Of course, Leap is quite a long process, or it can be a long process when you really get into the detail. So today we're going to do it in a simplified way and pretend that we're part of the internal assessment team for a fictitious company called FastBite. But at the end, we hope that by presenting it in this more interactive way, we'll understand the process a bit better. So, as a reminder, Landon's already talked us through the 4 phases of Leap that we see on the screen here. What happens in each phase and how companies actually use Leap are flexible and iterative. So, really, we're just looking to get to grips with the basics of each step here. And it's not intended to be a full and comprehensive overview of Leap. But as we've said as well, this isn't necessarily something that you have to apply in a set order. You can also revisit each of these phases. You can iterate this process as well. So, as we've mentioned, LEAP is undertaken by an internal assessment team. So, for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to pretend that we're part of that assessment team. For use of LEAP as well, you can also use it as both a corporate or a financial institution. The approach they take is a little bit different. Today, we're going to start with looking at a company example, which will hopefully help us to understand the essentials of the approach. But if you're in a financial institution, you might also want to think about how you could apply these activities at a portfolio level. And some important points just to keep in mind for this exercise is that it's hypothetical and just for illustrative purposes, but hopefully can give us a little bit of an insight to the approach. So moving on to introduce the company we're going to use for our case study today, FastBite. So FastBite, as we say, is hypothetical, but they're based on, experiences of real companies. It's a major listed US fast food chain that sells all the types of food you'd normally expect, burgers, fries, etc. An important part of their business model is having access to consistent and high quality year round supplies of agricultural commodities. And they have a supply chain that runs across the US and North and South America to source these goods. They've already started to see a number of risks relating to nature arising for their organization already. They've seen potential increases in costs and lack of reliability in the supply of their agricultural commodities coming from things such as extreme weather events, invasive pests, etc. They've also started to see that their stakeholders are putting more pressure on them to act on sustainability. They've had some negative media coverage and scrutiny from NGOs due to some links between their products and beef suppliers that are contributing to deforestation in the Amazon, for example. And so they decided they want to undertake a LEAP assessment to help them better understand these risks and opportunities and to ultimately build their resilience and respond to those demands that they're already seeing for more understanding on this topic. So if we are working through this exercise for LEAP, let's say we'll start with the scoping exercise. So the purpose of the scoping phase is to get a shared internal understanding and align different resource scopes on what is needed to conduct a full assessment. So, thinking about FastBite and what we've heard about their business so far, let's have a go at thinking if FastBite wanted to understand how it interacts with nature, which of these aspects do you think that they would need to consider to inform their LEAP assessment? So, this question is multiple choice, so you can select more than one thing here. If you think that more than one of these things is relevant for them to consider at the scoping stage. So take a moment and you can vote for which ones you think that they would need to include when they're setting out the scope for their LEAP assessment. So there may be 1 or 2 trick answers in here just to give you a spoiler, but you might also think that a lot of these sound quite relevant. They'll all come into LEAP at some stage in the process, but what we're aiming to zone in on at this phase is what in particular is most important for the scoping stage. Okay, so it looks so far like lots of you think that in particular, well, most of them by the sounds of it, but timeline and resources, the value chain, and maybe gathering the detailed data are important things. So we would say that Almost all of these would be relevant to consider at the scoping stage. The only one we would say is not relevant at this point is to gather detailed data on sites or locations, because actually this is too detailed for the scoping stage, and that's something that's going to be covered later in other parts of the LEAP approach. The aim of scoping is really just to get a high level understanding that allows the organization to plan for its approach in terms of times, resources, and who's going to input, so that there's a shared common understanding there to move forward with. TJ, I'll come to you quickly. Is there anything that you chip in here just to highlight that you think from experience of companies is most important for scoping?
Yeah, I think Fiona, you've mentioned most of the things. I mean, it's very what is very important is just keep it very high level. I think you need to first think more on a very high level perspective of what things you want to focus on. Don't go too much in details, because if you start going too much in detail, you will get stuck in the detail. So I think my suggestion would be to keep it very high level. It's important to just get started. I think that is the most important thing. And while you are doing the leap approach, there will be a lot of iterations. So be flexible and open to change. Open to change in terms of finding out new risk, how to mitigate those risks, and things like that. Lastly, I would want you to also understand that it's important to get your senior management's buy-in, because once you have their buy-in, the scoping study and the full leap approach would be much more impactful once you go into a bit more details. Yeah, that's about it.
Brilliant. Thanks, TJ. I think that's all really good advice for companies. Great. So let's move to look at the next phase then, which is locate. So as we said, in scoping, we've established, at a high level what we're looking to do. And when we're moving into locate, we're going to start to identify the potentially material nature-related issues that the company wants to focus its assessment on. So this is where FastBite then will need to start to get a better understanding of its value chain and its operating locations as one part of the locate phase. So our next question to have a go at this together is to ask you to think about, of these business activities that you see on the screen here, which of these do you expect would be present within FastBite's operations or value chain? And just to recap, by value chain, we mean either things that are upstream of the business, so its supply chain, for example, but also things that are downstream, so the use of its products by customers who consume it, maybe how its waste is dealt with, etc. So take a moment and have a think. Again, there's no right answer here because this is just a hypothetical example. It's just getting you to work through what the steps would be for FastBite. So as I think a lot of you can see here, it may well be possible that all of these could be somewhere within FastBite's value chain. I think we know already that, of course, crop production, animal production, and waste are very likely to be core aspects of the operations of FastBite and its suppliers. But what could be interesting for them to get answers on is understanding, from a real estate perspective, what's their role? Do they operate infrastructure? Do they maybe lease buildings? Making sure they understand that relationship when they're setting out the assessment. Then they might want to uncover some things like, what type of transportation is happening at the moment? Is marine transportation relevant to them, or is it, mostly going via land, for example? And then energy production, what are their energy sources? Which types of energy are they sourcing? And what could that mean in terms of the types of nature issues? So we all know that it can often be easy to find what's in our direct value chain, but maybe a little bit harder to know what is outside of that within our wider value chain, sorry, not our operations. So that's where it's important at the locate phase to figure that out, understand where the company touches nature, and which parts we think are going to be most critical to assess at the next stage. Anything else you'd add here, TJ?
No, I think
Nope.
that's good enough. Yeah.
No problem. We'll go into a bit more detail now, of course, moving into evaluate. So evaluate is really all around then identifying potential material nature related issues to focus the assessment on. So we've talked already there about which business activities we think could be present in FastBite's value chain. So let's say now that we're taking forward the ones that we think are going to be most interesting to start with to assess. And we'll start to think a bit more about their particular connection to nature. So, of course, evaluate is likely to be a little bit more complicated than this, but a simple version of this is just to take each of those aspects of the value chain that we've talked about there and to rank how much do we think that FastBite's activities are impacting that asset element, and how much do we think they maybe rely on nature to provide that service. So, for example, if we take crop production, what do we think the environmental impact of crop production is, and how significant is that? Versus, obviously, how reliant are FastBite on the provision that comes from nature and ecosystem services to allow it to produce crops. Of course, we think for that one, I think we'd all agree it's probably likely to be quite high. But really, as we say, this is not an exact process, and there's going to be an element of subjectivity here. But the aim of this phase is just to have a go at evaluating that and thinking about those two lenses, basically, of dependency and impact for each issue, to sort of zone in on which we think is most important to assess and which ones are likely to have the biggest hotspots in terms of nature-related risks and opportunities for our business. So looking at what you've all assessed, I think it looks like we're zoning in on maybe waste as perhaps the most environmentally damaging element there, but maybe the most dependent being crop production. And then, of course, we've said all of these we think are quite important, but maybe the marine transportation side, perhaps for them, the least significant at this point. Anything you'd bring in, TJ, to contribute here about maybe what the typical impacts and dependencies could be for FastBite relating to these different types of activity?
Yeah, so I think very well said, Fiona. I think for specifically if we talk about these sort of business activities which you've mentioned here, so as if we talk about crop production, it has very high dependency on this specific business model, and very high dependency on water supply for irrigation, and very highly dependent on soil quality. So that is a massive dependency. And the impact would be very high materiality for water use, land use, crops like rice or sugar, and large areas of fresh water. So, for example, if you take marine transportation, it has high dependency on flood mitigation services provided by ecosystems, which protects the transport infrastructure on the coast. And the impact would be it also has super high materiality for introducing invasive species. And if we talk specifically on animal production, that is that also has high dependency on soil quality, dependent on healthy and fertile soils to provide production of animal feed. And similarly, if we talk about the impacts, it has high impact on nature through land use, and requires large areas of land for housing the animals and all necessary facilities for pasture as well as to grow any supplemental feed and grazing. Lastly, if we talk about waste collection, treatment, and disposal, that also has very high dependency on solid waste remediation services, and how ecosystems transform organic or inorganic substances, which reduces the volume of waste and facilities treatment of waste. And similarly, very high impact on nature through emission of pollutants to soil and water. So this is how you would understand your dependencies and impacts of that specific business.
Great, thanks for pulling out those examples. I think that hopefully helps to bring to life everyone the sorts of things you could start to dig into here. Okay, so moving on now to our assess stage. So our question here is really around thinking of what the financial materiality is of potential risks and opportunities for the business. So in that stage before, we thought about what the dependencies and impacts are. We're now wanting to really make that business risk connection and think about how that would manifest for the company. So we've got a bit of a reminder here just to show you of the different types of nature-related risk and opportunity that could be relevant for the business. So we won't work through all of these, but you can also take a look at this in the TNFD framework resources if you'd like to understand them more. But at a high level, we've got kind of physical risks relating to direct threats caused by changes in the state of nature. So, for example, disruptions from water scarcity or maybe coastal flooding, for example. We've got transition risks, which speak about the threats arising from society's responses to nature loss. So things relating to policy, changing market dynamics, reputation. We've also got systemic risks which affect the wider economy. So the wider sort of breakdown of entire natural systems, which could really cascade across markets and create significant implications. And then finally, of course, not to forget nature-related opportunities, which are activities that either enhance business performance or sustainability performance. So you see those on the right-hand side of the diagram here. And so we don't have to cover all of these now, but just as a reminder, there's quite a broad set of risk and opportunity types that organizations can think about here. So important not to forget some of these types as well when you're doing your assessment. So, in the interests of trying to keep this simple for our exercise together today, what we've done is suggested a few things that we think could be potential risks for FastBite based on what we know about them already. So, for example, here we've got potential flooding in its kind of upstream supply chain in agricultural commodities, which could reduce the supply of its agricultural goods. Maybe that's resulting to deforestation, for example, which is reducing, water retention in soils. And as you're already doing, you can have a go at rating these risks as well, seeing which you think would be most significant for FastBite, which is really the thing we'll be looking to do then as part of this assess phase to zone in on which we think are the most material risks from a business perspective. But again, we've got examples of, the impact that soil degradation could have on the yields from crops, which again could, lead to price rises, reduced reliability of supply. And then looking at maybe the direct operations, possible risks could be relating to changes in regulation and policy, which might lead to higher due diligence requirements on its suppliers, for example. We've already heard that FastBite has seen some negative reputational impacts from its links to beef suppliers. So that could lead to customers choosing to go elsewhere if it's not managing those risks correctly. And then finally, as well, we're seeing that point around potential changes in technology that could be needed to manage some of these risks and the need to invest in that. So it looks like we're all agreed that these are potential relevant risks for FastBite. It looks like actually you've highlighted the physical risks relating to how it sources its agricultural commodities as being potentially the most significant, which may well be very true. And I think even though they're upstream of the business, which could be something they overlook, what we could see here is actually if they systemically mean that it can't get the commodities it needs to supply its customers, then of course that's a big problem for its business model. Great. And turning to you, TJ, obviously we've talked about a few key risks here. Do you think any of these you would rate them any differently, or do you agree what people have said here?
Yeah, I think before I get into the risk, I want to just answer in a question which came in, which is the difference between evaluate and assess. It is very important to understand this difference because when you are looking at evaluate, you're looking at your own organization's risks in terms of how your nature-based risk for your own organization, right? Assess is about evaluating those specific risks and understanding how to mitigate those risks, right? Once you start mitigating those risks, that is when you create an opportunity, right? So for example, if my business has a specific risk on water scarcity, as you mentioned, Fiona, then my job in assess would be to how do I mitigate that water scarcity risk in order to create a more opportunity for my business, right? So that is one side of the business. And then of course, there are other opportunities also which business can create in terms of like financing opportunities to get more financing at a cheaper rate and things like that. So there are two kinds of opportunities we are talking about, but the opportunities will only come once you mitigate those risks which you understand in the evaluate phase. So that is the difference between evaluate and assess, right? Not talking just about the close relationship between different types of nature-related risks, specifically physical and transition risk, how they interact with each other. For example, in FastBite's case, it might be exposed to acute physical risk by its choice of suppliers and their connections to activities such as deforestation. So in turn, these activities might drive more chronic risks like soil degradation that increase exposure to chronic risk. It also might drive transition risks through policy or legal risks, or reputational risk if this is perceived negatively through customers, right? So if we mitigate those risks, that will create an opportunity for your organization. And what we learned from pilot testers, organizations should use a range of methods and tools to support their assessment and get familiar with their benefits and limitations. right? So ultimately, the assess phase is about understanding which nature-related risks are financially material to the organization, which is basically if the soil gets affected, financially material. If water gets affected, financially material. And that helps organizations understand how to integrate these risks into existing risk management processes and then mitigate those risks.
Great. Thanks, TJ. I think that really helps to clarify things there as well. Thanks for picking up that question we'd had too. That's great. All right, so this brings us around to talking about the last phase of the LEAP approach, which is prepare. So the purpose of prepare is really to decide then how the organization is going to respond to those nature-related issues that it's identified. So well, let's have a little go at doing that for Fast Bites. So we've obviously heard quite a lot already and considered Fast Bites dependencies and impacts in the assess phase. We've then thought about what the particular business risks and opportunities are and evaluate. There's a load of different issues there, but have a go at thinking about what's one action that you think that Fastbite could take to respond or mitigate some of those risks, or maybe capitalize on opportunities as well that we've identified. So, of course, there's going to be a whole host of different things that they could do depending on the issue that they're looking at, but maybe just take one aspect of this and think about what you think a potential response could be, or maybe you think there's something overall that they could do in their business that could help them to better manage all of these types of issues. I see one person has shared accountability. Someone else has mentioned looking at supply chain. Indeed, that's going to be really key here because I think we're already identifying a lot of these issues will sit in the supply chain. Um, Commitment from management to form a team. Yeah, exactly. I mean, hopefully, at least at the scoping phase, they agreed a team to do the LEAP approach the first time, but it might be now they need to agree the owners for taking forward particular actions. So I think that's a really good point. Someone's mentioned maybe lab grown meat. Yeah, potentially that could really help manage some of those risks that it's exposed to there by reducing the kind of nature dependency and impact potentially as well. Lovely. Lovely, great ideas, everyone. Assessing its value chain, maybe using renewable energy, thinking about its sustainable sourcing policies. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. Loads of great ideas here. So I think you very much get the idea of what we're doing in Prepare, which is really thinking about how we connect between what we've identified as a risk or opportunity and what we're going to practically put in place to support us in managing that. And here you might want to think about applying a hierarchy approach to which kind of is coming out in the LEAP guidance as well, thinking about the different types of action you could apply. So thinking about avoid first, how can you actually avoid the negative impact from happening in the first place or eliminate it? Then thinking about how you could reduce it if you can't avoid it. Then moving on to regeneration, so thinking about actions that are designed to maybe increase or support improved biological or ecological functioning. And then finally, restore. So, actually, things that could maybe even accelerate the recovery of ecosystems as well. Great. Just before we finish up, I'll pass back to you, TJ, in case there's anything you think it'd be good to highlight in closing here.
Yes, I think I also want to mention one more example I was in my mind which I was coming. So, this is a very interesting example of you will understand how you can differentiate between these four stages. There is a big European company uh, and who they manufacture and they source coffee, right? They have a big coffee business. 80% of their coffee revenue comes from this one plantation in Colombia, right? 80% of their coffee business comes from this one plantation in Colombia. When they did their LEAP assessment, right, while they were doing their locate, evaluate assessment, they understood that that one plantation, which the 80% of the revenue comes from, that is highly under water stress and soil stress and extreme heat stress, right? So when they were doing the LEAP assessment, they located their risks. Okay, they located the risk. The biggest risk is the 80% of the revenue comes from this one plantation. When they evaluated, they evaluated that okay, we have water stress, heat stress, soil stress. And then in the assess phase, they started understanding, oh, now we need to figure out a different way to mitigate that risk. So they started looking for another plantation elsewhere in Colombia or elsewhere in the world, right? So this is a real life example I'm telling you that how organizations are using LEAP approach to understand their nature-based risks, which are financially material to the organization. Over here, 80% of their revenue came from this one plantation. So imagine how financially material it would have been for their organization, right? And eventually, when they did prepare, they understood that climate and nature are interconnected. And it is important to therefore take an integrated approach to reporting. So they integrated both climate and nature to understand, okay, this is our problem. And then they started expanding on that module, right? And this is what the prepare phase is all about. You put it all together, and then you put it all together for your shareholders, for your investors to see, so that they can understand that you're mitigating those specific nature-based risks in your organization. Right? So this is and the example I gave you is a very real life example. 80% of their revenue came from that one plantation in Colombia. So these are the kind of things which can happen while you're doing business, and your organization is could be exposed to nature-based risks.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, as you say, so great to have examples that really bring this to life. But yeah, as you see, that brings us to the end of the Menti exercise. So that stepped us through each phase of the LEAP approach, hopefully giving us a bit of a better understanding of what an organization would be practically doing at each of those phases. So obviously, we've used FastBite today to help us understand those activities. For your organization, the nature-related dependencies, impacts, etc., could be quite different, of course, and maybe they're not so obvious. So, for example, if you're in a secondary or a tertiary sector, it's really only when you get into this process and you map things and locate that you could actually find out more about your interfaces with nature. So, really, that's what LEAP is all about and helping you to discover. Great. So, providing you with that kind of high level overview of how LEAP can be used, we're going to move on now in this module to take a little bit of a look at this in practice, starting out by giving you an overview of some tools and then passing over to Yusuf from S&P, who's going to take us through another case study from their perspective. So just to mention that there is a lot out there that can help you to work on this topic. So we won't be diving into lots of individual tools today, but what I want to highlight here is that there is a whole host of different tools available for a variety of purposes to support your LEAP approach. So the best resource to help you with this is looking at the TNFD tools catalog, which we link from this slide here. And we just show on this slide an example of the different types of data sets that you could find in a range of these tools. And so there's no single right tool or data that's going to work for every use case here, because of course every organization is different. You're in a different sector, geography, you have different nature-related issues that you're looking to assess. So the important thing here is to think about what the right tool is for what you're trying to assess, and also to be a bit proportionate here. So some of these tools might be a little bit technical if you're just getting started, and that's okay. You might want to pick something a little bit more high level to get you started and then move on to these things in time. And if you want some help in picking the right tool, there's an extra slide in the handout here which gives you some considerations to help you select the right tool for your use case. But just to give a couple of specific examples of what's out there in the market, here's a range of different tools you could consider. So these could be both of interest for companies and financial institutions, because either you might want to use them directly, or you might also want to use them to help understand better how your investors could already be assessing your business. So we're going to hear from S&P in a moment about their work, but they've developed a global nature and biodiversity risk data set and a nature risk platform that's built upon the S&P nature risk profile that was developed in partnership with the UNEP-FI. And that's really designed to support companies, investors, and other entities to better understand, manage, and mitigate their exposure to nature-related risks and impacts. And then we have another interesting tool coming from Robeco, which is their biodiversity traffic light. So this tool is all around assessing corporate positioning on biodiversity to support investors in identifying leaders and laggards. So perhaps interesting for you to know that maybe that's something your investors could already be using to look at what you're doing on this topic and how exposed you are. And then finally, as well, we have the WWF Biodiversity Risk Filter, which is a free online tool enabling both companies and financial institutions to screen their portfolios, their activities for different types of biodiversity risk. So just a few examples here. There are many more tools out there which are being used by organizations. But one in particular, of course, that we've mentioned there is S&P's tool. And it's something they've very actively been supporting companies with on LEAP assessments already. So I'll pass over to you now, Yusuf, to talk us through that. And I'll give you the slide control.
Thank you, Fiona. Hope you can hear me well. Otherwise, just please let me know. So yeah, thank you. And like Fiona said, I want to walk you through a practical example of a company that went through the LEAP process and used some of our tools, and we supported them. But really, I think the idea is that this is not a, one way to do it. It's not a super strict, you have to do A before B and so on. And it's not a one shot. So it's something that companies typically mature over time. But let's go practically through this whole process. And LEAP, I think by now we all know what it means, so I don't need to repeat that. But let's look at the example here. So we're talking about a first-time LEAP assessment for a global petrochemical company. It's headquartered in the US. It's quite large, and it has 30 production facilities and plants globally. And what they want to achieve is they want to get ahead of upcoming regulatory requirements, such as the EU CSRD, but they also just, in pure self-interest, want to understand and quantify their risks and manage them. Now, one part that is not strictly reflected in the LEAP process is the scoping, and that's typically what's happening at the very beginning. And there we decide what we want to focus on. And the decision was that we focus on the own operations of this company first. Upstream, we did a little bit of work there. The company procures oil and fossil fuels, which comes to them via pipelines. So we looked at some pipelines, but other than that, it's a commodity. So it's quite limited. And downstream as well, out of scope, the plastic products that land in the hands of consumers, it's really hard to trace, and then it's millions of consumers. So there's still a methodological open point there. So that was the first step, getting the scope right. And then we jump right into the first step or first phase, which is locate, where we locate the interface with nature. And what we did there was we prioritized the assets and then looked at the most important ones, where we then literally went into polygon mapping on a map where we defined the perimeter of the asset. And then we already learn a couple of things. So you see an example here. We have a plant that is doing ethylene production, ethylene and derivatives. It's in the US. The biome it's located in is temperate coniferous forest. And mapping that asset allows us already to say a couple of things about it. So for example, there's no overlap with a key biodiversity or an otherwise protected area, which is one risk flag that we can already exclude. Then we know it's next to a river and there's some water intake for cooling purposes. So in the processes, we know that there's potential impact due to chemical pollution or microplastics. There is some agriculture around it. And then there's just purely land use from storage infrastructure, tanks, piping, and so on. So that's number one. We draw a perimeter around the assets. Then we move into the evaluate phase, and this is where our methodology is being applied. And we ask ourselves a couple of questions around impacts and dependencies. For impacts, we answer the questions, what is the footprint of the asset? So specifically the land use of my operations. We want to know what is the ecological significance of this location, which means how important is this piece of land to species and how important is this land to people and economic activity. And lastly, we ask ourselves, what's the level of environmental degradation? And this we do for the asset at this exact location. Okay, so that's the point. That's why it's geolocalized. We know where the asset is, and we know and we can determine what those factors are in this exact location. On the dependency side, we look at ecosystem services. So the company is dependent on ecosystem services. I think you all know Encore, and our methodology here draws upon that. And so for more than 20 ecosystem services, we look at two questions. Number one, how relevant is this ecosystem for my operations? And number two, how vulnerable is this ecosystem service at this location? So for example, groundwater. I need groundwater. This type of production process is dependent on it. But then there's a difference whether this operation is in, let's say, Finland or in Egypt or in India, or even just in the north of India or the south of India. And that's something very important. Now, this we apply to all the priority assets, and the output you can see here. So we have a bunch of metrics on the one hand side impacts, on the other hand side dependencies. So impacts would be typically the footprint of the asset. Then an impact ratio, this is one of the metrics that we use, which is composed of the ecosystem degradation and the ecosystem significance. And that we can further break down. So ecosystem significance breaks down into the significance to species and the significance to people. And in this case, we see that the degradation is not very high, but the ecosystem significance is somewhat higher. And the reason for that is because of significance to people. Okay. So that's one learning already. And as we said before, no overlap with key biodiversity or protected areas. On the dependency side, we have a dependency score per ecosystem services. And the composite dependency is kind of the aggregated value of that, where we can dive into each ecosystem service and look at which ones are elevated. So for example, here, a couple are not relevant at all, such as animal-based energy, but something like water quality might be elevated, okay? So this is what we do with all the assets that we investigated. And then once we know that, we move into the assess phase, where we look at the top impacts and dependencies that we identified from the prior step, which was the evaluate phase. And for each of them, we now try to translate this into an opportunity or an impact that results from these impacts and dependencies. So risks and opportunities is kind of the output of this step, and it's built upon the impacts and dependencies of the prior step. So for example, for impacts to surrounding communities, we learned in the prior step that there is impact to peoples potentially. And then we define, actually, based on what this company does in this particular location, what are actually things that could happen? So for example, there could be effluent discharge of substances of concern over the limit, impacting local communities and fisheries. So basically, we have wastewater that is impacting local communities and fisheries. That's something to be concerned about. Or there could be air emissions settling on the local farmland. And then we go into these risks and assess them more specifically. And here we are trying to be aligned with the company's risk management framework. So typically there's a financial impact, but also a lot of risk management frameworks have something like an operational impact, a reputational impact, and there are certain thresholds. So for this company, they have a certain threshold. So let's say every damage that is below $10,000 is a 1 out of 5. Everything that is above $1 million is, let's say, a 3 out of 5, and everything that is above 100 million is a 5 out of 5. And based on this logic, we analyze this. So here it's important that we have local risk management experts and site level experts, and they discuss, what could actually happen and how bad could it be. And when we look at this first risk, such as the wastewater, what could happen? Well, there could be an enforced shutdown if the pollutant thresholds are exceeded, so that a local regulator shuts down the plant, and that would be a huge impact. There could also be community protests and reputational loss, and this is quite high. So the way that you would look at this is something like, okay, a 1 out of 5 is maybe a short local news story, a 3 out of 5 is a national news story, and the 5 out of 5 is a long-term global news story. So this is how companies set up their risk management frameworks. And then lastly, it could be leading to regulatory tightening so that the limits are then tighter and higher compliance costs. And we do this for all the main top impacts and dependencies, such as, for example, dependence on water quality in this case. What could happen here? If the water quality is not good, then the asset could be negatively impacted. So asset integrity. It could also lead to reduced process reliability, but also to increased operational costs. So for example, asset integrity, negative impact. What could happen? Well, there could be impurities and they create corrosion in certain technical parts and they need to be replaced more frequently. And that is typically a small impact because, just a bit more investment in spare parts is not a big deal. The big deal is if you have an unplanned shutdown because of a leakage, and that leads to cleanup, to repair, and it automatically has a big financial impact and a decent reputational impact. And so again, this is something that needs to be done with local experts and risk management professionals. And once you know that, you have a pretty good understanding what are my top risks here, and you can add them to your enterprise risk management register. So for example, if we identify that this low water quality impacting my equipment integrity is something that we really need to watch out for, then that's something we add to the risk management register. And based on that, we define an approach. How do we deal with this? So for example, we want to have maybe policies. Maybe we have a policy and we update it, the water resource management policy, or we don't have a policy, then we create one. We can implement some actions such as upgrade filtration systems. We can install particle sensors. The metrics are then aligned with that. So for example, I want to measure the water quality. Okay, I can also measure the asset integrity with certain erosion rates at critical points of the equipment. And so then you have a really good way of managing those impacts. And ultimately, it culminates in disclosure in the TNFD logic. You want to talk about the governance, who is responsible for overseeing and managing this risk. Then also just describing what is the risk and its potential impact. Risk management, explain how the risk is identified, assessed, and managed. And lastly, metrics and targets. How do you measure this risk and what targets do you set yourself? And that's pretty much it. So this is how you would go through all the major risks. You start, of course, with the most important ones. It's all an exercise in prioritization. It's not a one shot. And so over time, you mature and you just get better at managing this. And that's pretty much it.
Great, thanks so much for that, Yusuf. Really good. So just to finish off this segment, we're going to have a quick poll question just to get a sense from you all. So you've heard from TNFD, from us, and from S&P, various approaches to LEAP there, and you've heard about the different stages and what's involved. We'd like to know which of those, from what you've heard so far, do you think is going to be the biggest challenge for your organization? And if you'd like to, feel free to share in the chat maybe why you think that aspect would be particularly challenging, or maybe you have a challenge across the whole LEAP approach that you want to ask us about. And we'll just take a moment to discuss those responses as well. We'll give you a couple more seconds to answer, and then we'll have a look at the results. As I said, feel free to share in the chat if you've got any particular challenges you're dealing with here. We can have a quick talk about those as well. Great. Let's end the poll and I'll share the results. So it looks like we're coming out with the top answers being evaluate and assess, which is maybe not so surprising because I guess that's getting into the detail of how to do the assessments. I mean, I think already, Yusuf and TJ, we talked through lots of tips for companies here. And someone's also mentioned scoping being hard because they wouldn't know what things could be challenging. But would just be interested, do you have any advice from the experiences of companies you've worked with on, maybe how they would overcome some of the challenges here? Maybe it's about data availability, maybe it's about getting buy-in or just knowing where to start. But maybe I'll start with you first, Yusuf.
Yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense. I think evaluate and assess are typically the most critical phases. I think getting nature data, because it's so complicated, is something that is hard to explain. One ton of CO2 is the same across the world. If you emit it here or there, it doesn't make a difference. But here it's quite complex and it is multidimensional. And that's also why our approach has more than 100 individual metrics, but you just need to learn to interpret it, and focus on what's important, prioritize it right, and then you learn it. And the assess phase is then something where it gets very localized. So if you really wanna know what's happening, you almost have to go to the location and figure out, how it's actually, what's the situation on the ground. And I think there was one question in the Q&A which relates probably to the case study. What is the area in kilometers or hectares it can zoom down to? So I think in terms of the footprint, you can do it basically. This is a perfect answer. If you draw the circle around the asset, it's pretty much precise. When it comes to those nature layers, it depends. So certain things are a bit more high level. Others maybe go down to 1 kilometer resolution.
Great. Thanks so much for picking up that question as well. Maybe you could just type that in the chat as well, just in case they missed it. But thank you. TJ as well. Maybe I see a few people have commented that they think scoping could be the challenging part for them. Just as we close out this segment, maybe just a final word if you have anything you'd highlight for them on scoping or anything else you'd mentioned just as we close this out.
Yeah, I think firstly, I completely agree with Joseph in all the points he mentioned in terms of evaluate and assess. I think what is most important is honestly just to get started. I think everybody, especially organizations, they go too much in detail and they go too much in complexity that they forget to get started. I think it's just important to get started first of all. How to get started and all the other guidance in terms of scoping, locate, evaluate, assess, prepare is available on the TNFD website. That guidance is made for organizations to use them and to understand how to get started, how to go through this each approach of locate, evaluate, assess, prepare. There's a LEAP guidance specifically for that. Um, there are also a lot of questions asking about different sectors. There was a mining question, some tech question. So TNFD has this sector guidance available on the TNFD website also. It is available right now for about 18 different sectors, I think. So you can go and if you want to if you have specific questions around your specific sector, whether it's automobile, technology, metals and mining, you can go to the TNFD website. I will share a link here. You can download that guidance and it'll give you more clarity on what you need to do. So I think there is all the guidance available on the website. It is important to get started. In terms of data, yes, you will have face data issues, but don't worry about it. Everybody is facing it. It's not like only you are facing it. The whole world is facing data issues. So that should not restrict you from not starting it, right? Data will come with in time, but I think it's important to just understand what your nature-related dependencies and impacts are and how you can mitigate those impacts. So I think last point I want to just make it is important to just get started. Thank you.
I think what better way to end this segment. Thank you very much. And thank you both for the great contributions there. I think lots of really practical insights and advice for companies to get started on this. So big thanks both for your presentations and input. Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so this is just bringing us now to the end of our implement module, which is the third of our four modules. So I think we've already sort of recapped these points quite well, but just to cover them off briefly and what we talked about. So we really started this segment by talking about that organizational wide approach that you need to tackling nature. So the key mindset being really that an integrated and holistic approach that brings together all the relevant teams is an important starting point to move forward from here. We then talked through the recommended framework that you can use to support your assessments here. So this is the LEAP approach, as we've talked you through many times. And really to remember here that LEAP is flexible and it's iterative. So it's really just for you to use and get to grips with and have a go, as TJ said to you already there. And then finally, we saw TNFD and LEAP in action, and S&P really helps us to see how companies are using this phased approach and the different types of data and tools that we have available. So be sure to have a look at all of the resources and case studies that we've shared in the links and in the slide handout for some more inspiration here. Great. With that, we'll move into our last segment, module 4, and I'll hand over to you, Tiffany.
Thanks so much, Fiona. And yeah, last module. So well done, everyone. It looks like we're more or less on time as well. So we're just going to get through this last module together, which is on communicate, which of course is a key objective of most companies using the TNFD framework. So while this unit is last, it's certainly not least. Let's get into all the good content here now. So this unit breaks down into two key aspects and the importance of engaging Indigenous people and local communities across your activities to identify, assess, and report on nature. And secondly, how to include nature-related information into your reporting to investors. So let's dive first into engagement. And how companies should engage with other important groups as part of their nature-related analysis. Great. So, as we've been discussing, nature is increasingly shaping business strategy, risk, and opportunity. And as that happens, stakeholder expectations are rising rapidly. So, as you can see on this slide, there's a range of groups now who want to be clearer on information from companies on how they impact nature, how they depend on nature, and how they plan to manage nature-related risks and opportunities. So, as you can see here, that could be regulators, policymakers, indigenous peoples, which are emphasizing cultural preservation, rights, and protection of territories that are often biodiversity rich. Also, civil society organizations, investors, of course, and many others, from customers and suppliers to local communities. So, what this means for companies is that nature-related data and disclosure are no longer optional. They're becoming a core part of how organizations are assessed, how they're trusted, and how they're financed. But there's many benefits. So understanding nature and nature-related issues from the perspective of indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders in particular provide really important benefits to an organization. So we highlight some of the key benefits on this slide, such as meeting reporting requirements, so demonstrating meaningful engagement and effective processes to consider the views of indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholder groups in the company processes is indeed a requirement of various reporting standards and jurisdictional requirements. It also helps to manage and respond to nature-related issues effectively. Collaboration, inclusive, respective, and open collaboration with Indigenous peoples and local communities in order to identify shared approaches. And it creates really good opportunities. Now, it's important to note that failure to meaningfully engage can also lead to significant risks and, of course, lost opportunities for companies. So who do you engage then? So there are numerous groups of people to engage with, depending on the organization, sector, and geography. So, for example, rights holders. This includes individuals whose human rights are affected, including the rights to water, to food, to an adequate standard of living, and the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environments. This category also includes members of groups whose collective rights are affected, especially Indigenous peoples and local communities. Then there's also stakeholders, which includes financial institutions such as investors and their capital providers and insurers, as well as government agencies and policymakers and regulatory authorities, etc. Corporates need to understand which Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders are connected with their direct operations or along their value chain. So let's dive in a little bit deeper into Indigenous people and local communities. So Indigenous people and local communities play a really unique and important role in nature-related disclosures because their lands host the majority of the world's remaining biodiversity, and their traditional knowledge and stewardship practices are proven to slow or reverse nature loss. The TNFD emphasizes that engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities is not only a matter of respecting internationally recognized rights, such as free, prior, and informed consent, but it's also essential for identifying and managing nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. The TNFD has produced guidance to support meaningful engagement by companies and financial institutions with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other affected stakeholders. And this guidance is built on established international standards and frameworks, particularly the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So with that, oh, there's the publication that you can take a look at. With that, I'm going to pass over to Landon, who's going to take us through the next section. Over to you, Landon.
Great. Thanks so much, Tiffany. Excuse me, just getting my voice back here. Excuse me. So, oh, sorry, minor tech issue. Okay, great. There we go. So we're going to move on to investor reporting. And again, well done, everyone. This is now our final unit, but this is, of course, a key unit. So let's give it one last push so that we wrap up on this important topic. And this unit, we're also covering a lot of kind of real world examples, hopefully to bring it a bit more to life. We're going to have a final word from Harshal from JSW on what his advice would be to a company just getting started on this topic and wondering, perhaps as you might be now, what your next steps should be.
TNFD is a strategic risk tool to further strengthen the ERM programs which we all run within our businesses. So it is an exercise to future-proof our business. So with that thing in mind, while we engage with the stakeholders, please focus on translating nature-related risk into business language. Link ecosystem dependencies to cost, maybe downtime, our permits, our expansion plans and timeline, maybe financing. So, and one more important thing is TNFD is an iterative by design. So I think focus on materiality, then perfection when you start.
Great. So hopefully that helps to show you a little bit why reporting to investors on nature is becoming increasingly important and that other companies are already getting started on providing investor-focused disclosures. Now let's look a little bit more at what this means in practice. And one key message is that you don't need to wait for mandatory requirements to be in place. Even if you're not currently required to disclose nature-related information, every organization should still begin assessing its nature-related issues. By doing this early, it can help strengthen organization resilience, improve strategic decision-making, and help companies anticipate risks and opportunities across their value chains. At the same time, we're also seeing some very clear signals that nature-related reporting will become part of mainstream standards. A major milestone recently, which you may have heard about, was the IFRS Foundation's announcement that the ISSB, or International Sustainability Standards Board, will begin a standard-setting process on nature, building directly on the TNFD recommendations. Just to clarify, there has been maybe some confusion about this. This does not mean there will be a new S3 standard. As we know, there's S1 and S2, but it does, and it also does not mean that the TNFD recommendations will simply become mandatory ISSB text. Instead, the ISSB will draw from the TNFD's recommendations, metrics, and guidance to help shape investor-focused decision-useful disclosures, and that will be consistent with S1 and S2. What that does mean is that nature is expected to increasingly be integrated into disclosure standards and requirements based on these standards. So the key takeaway here is that starting now puts organizations in a far stronger position. So everyone on this webinar has already taken a good step in getting ahead of the curve. And the TNFD already aligns with major reporting systems and early assessment work, including using tools like LEAP, building the capability companies will need as standards continue to evolve. We know nature-related reporting is increasingly vital, and as we showed in the video, there's many companies that are already making disclosures. Now that we've explored why nature-related information matters to investors, I want to spend a few minutes on how to communicate this information more effectively. And to help companies do this well, the UNSSE has developed a nature disclosures checklist included in the model guidance on nature-related financial disclosures. You'll find that in Annex 1 of the guidance, and we'll try to reshare the link again in the chat. I know we've shared it a couple of times with you. When preparing nature-related disclosures, there are several important principles to keep in mind. Number one, you should speak the language of investors. So knowing your audience, investors want clear decision, useful information about how nature affects the enterprise value. Two, you want to integrate your narratives. Nature, as we've discussed, is not sitting in a silo or off to the side, and neither should your disclosures. Third, you want to tailor your disclosures to your jurisdiction. Different markets are moving at different speeds, and they may have varying regulatory requirements. Fourth, you want to build trust through transparency and balance. Stakeholders value reporting that is honest about both progress as well as the challenges. Fifth, and finally, use data effectively to support that narrative. Data should reinforce your story and not overwhelm it. Now that we've covered the principles, we're going to explore what they look like in practice by reviewing the real examples I mentioned before from some company reports. Just before we do that, we have a quick disclaimer to highlight in that the examples we show are illustrative only. They're intended to bring the concepts to life, but we're not saying that these are best practice templates. Every company will still need to tailor the disclosures as we just discussed to its own context, material issues, and reporting approach. As we've also discussed, it's important that your disclosures use the right information and the right language to speak effectively to that investor audience. So to start with an example and illustrate what this looks like in practice, we have an example from Tallieri Bioindustries 2023 TCFD and TNFD report. This is a Nordic private asset manager specializing in private equity funds that invest in industrial scale facilities and technologies in the bioeconomy and circular economy. In this example, we see the company providing a clear example of several nature-related risks and opportunities that they've identified. And importantly, they also disclose the potential financial impacts associated with each of these risks and opportunities. One example that they highlight Sorry, I lost my slides, but is the increased risk of forest fires. So they explain that the forest fires can reduce the availability of key raw materials that in turn can drive up prices and affect the profitability of certain assets. This speaks directly to a key principle in the SSE Nature Disclosure Checklist, which is that companies should clearly link their DIROs to enterprise value. Another consideration when communicating to investors is that nature-related information should be integrated into climate and broader ESG narratives to show the connections between those dimensions. An important part of integrating nature into corporate reporting is making disclosure streamlined and concise across different standards so that users can easily navigate those pieces of information. And then to help us explore how this could work, we're going to look at another example here from Ørsted. You may know them. They're quite a large Danish multinational energy company. And Ørsted is quite interesting in that they've transformed from a fossil fuel intensive utility, they were formerly DONG Energy, into now the world's largest developer of offshore wind power. Here, Ørsted provides a useful example for us. They're using a correspondence table in their annual report to show how their disclosures align with TNFD recommended disclosures, and then where each item appears within that report. In case you can't read this totally clearly, I know the text is a bit small to fit this substantive table on the page, but the table has the main themes or the 4 content areas of the TNFD recommended disclosures on the left that Tiffany reviewed with you before, and then the report section and page where that information appears in the public disclosures. That kind of mapping helps report users quickly locate relevant information across multiple frameworks, which is really helpful for that investor audience and anyone else reading the report. Another important point when communicating with investors is understanding the legal and regulatory context in which you operate in. In other words, you need to know the rules of the game in your jurisdiction. And to note, as we've talked about before, the rules are evolving quite quickly. A practical step companies can take now is to map their disclosures to whichever requirements apply to them, which helps both regulators and investors understand your alignment. So even if you're, again, not yet required to disclose nature-related information, we still believe every organization should still be assessing its nature-related issues. Nature loss can affect any business model, so understanding your dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities is simply a smart and good business practice. Even without nature-specific rules, many jurisdictions already require disclosure of material issues. So if your internal assessment identifies something that could affect performance or license to operate, perhaps that's water dependencies or biodiversity impacts, then investors should know about it. The key takeaway here is that to understand your jurisdiction, map your disclosures, and assess your nature-related issues, you should be doing all of that now. In turn, it can strengthen trust, improve preparedness, and as we've said before, it positions you ahead of those rapidly emerging forthcoming reporting requirements. As we build on some of the points I just discussed with you, one of the most powerful ways to earn the confidence of investors in your market and stakeholders more broadly is simply transparency. With that, balanced, honest reporting goes a very long way in showing that your organization understands its nature-related issues and is also dealing with them responsibly. This also means being upfront about any uncertainties. It's completely normal at this stage to have data gaps or areas where methods are still developing. Investors aren't expecting perfection here, but they do appreciate value on the clarity or having value, clarity on this, on what's known, what's still being worked on, and where assumptions have been made. We can see this approach clearly in the example here from Ferrovial's integrated annual report. That's a major Spanish multinational. They're in the transport and infrastructure sector, and they're laying out the core hypothesis here behind their nature-related analysis. Here, they're explaining how biodiversity and ecosystems link to the resilience of their business model, and they point directly to the methodologies they used, including the integrated natural capital assessment approach. They also highlight how consultation with local communities shaped their understanding of risks and impacts. And what's especially helpful here is that they openly describe the assumptions that underpin their analysis. These can evolve as new information becomes available, but disclosing them now rather than later gives readers and investors a clear sense of how they've reached their conclusions. And finally, this sort of transparency should extend beyond investors. Organizations should also make sure they report back to Indigenous peoples, local communities, and other affected stakeholders in ways that are accessible as well as culturally appropriate, and also clearly explain how their insights help shape their risk assessments, materiality judgments, and their strategic decisions. We'll move along to our final example, and here we're looking at how organizations can bring their nature disclosures to life using data. Numbers here aren't just technical details. They can also help investors see real progress. They can help investors understand trends and help investors compare performance over time. And then when paired with a clear narrative, they can become quite powerful. This example here is coming from Manulife, Manulife's Natural Capital Report. For those who don't know Manulife, they're a huge Canadian insurance and financial services provider. They have significant timberland and agricultural investments as well. And what they're showing here is essentially the carbon balance of their timber, but presented in a way that's clear, structured, and decision useful. Here we see their calculation building on three variables. First, the starting point, which is the previous year's total forest carbon store, then any resource changes, which captures the shifts in acreage or updates in methodology from one year to the next. And finally, Manulife here shows the net biological change, which reflects the natural balance between tree growth and harvesting. On top of that, they're also tracking how much harvested timber ends up as solid wood with a long life. In this case, products that are assumed to store carbon for around 100 years. Each of these elements Manulife reports on separately and then combined here to show annual carbon removals. The result is a clear picture of how they're managing the nature-related dependencies, impacts, and opportunities within their timber portfolio on an annual basis year to year. I think what's especially effective here is this combination. There's a narrative that explains the logic and the risks that's supported by visuals as well as data that shows performance. And that pairing with clear storytelling plus robust metrics is exactly what investors want to see to make better informed decisions and understand how well an organization is really managing its nature-related issues. So hopefully those real life examples were useful, but I'm going to turn it back to Fiona to wrap up this unit.
Great. Thanks so much, Landon, for taking us through those examples. As you say, I hope that was really helpful for us all in getting clear on what this could look like. So a few key takeaways from this module. You remember that we started off with Tiffany looking at engagement of Indigenous people and local communities, because this is really a critical part of having a meaningful assessment of nature-related issues. These groups are the original custodians of the land, and they hold the deepest and most critical knowledge about the ecosystems that we all rely on. So it's not just a matter of fairness, but a matter of success. Because if you skip this step, you risk getting your assessments and your management strategies fundamentally wrong. The second thing we discussed here was all around getting ahead of the curve. So, whilst the direct adoption of these requirements may not be mandatory for you at the moment, perhaps preparing your voluntary disclosures now will help you get ready for tomorrow's mandatory requirements. And as we all know, the regulatory landscape is shifting fast. So, by starting to assess and report voluntarily today, you're essentially stress testing your systems and refining your data collection. And so that means as mandatory requirements are introduced, you're going to be in the right position to really gain advantage from those and to respond to them. And of course, if we've heard throughout the session as well, in the Indian context with the BRSR, there's already a clear interconnection with nature-related issues, and TNFD's materials can really support you in satisfying those reporting requirements too. And finally, we talked there about the key audience for your disclosures, the investors. So for this, your information needs to be balanced, transparent, and really speak their language. So crucially, you must connect your nature strategy directly to finance. You really need to show how nature-related risks will affect your capital allocations, your liabilities, and your strategic resilience. And so by ensuring that your data is investor grade, that's, rigorous, comparable, and clear, you're going to successfully build the trust you need to secure capital and demonstrate long-term stewardship. So overall, by using the TNFD's recommendations to structure your reporting, as we saw in that final series of examples that Landon shared with us, it's really a great way to ensure you're doing just that and meeting the needs of your investors. Okay, so we're coming up to time at the end of session, but I do think we have a little bit of time to reflect as a group on discussion questions. So let's have a think. I think we've had quite a lot of questions coming up in the chat. A few people, I guess, have asked quite detailed questions about LEAP in terms of quite particular aspects of the process, maybe certain data sets. I just wonder from our panelists, is there a particular next step that you might recommend for them there if they're kind of already in the process of working through LEAP and maybe they've reached a bit of a technical barrier about what to do in a particular aspect? Anything you'd recommend in terms of troubleshooting routes for that? Anyone that they could reach out to? I know all of the contact details for our organizations are at the end of the presentation. So that's certainly one route that you can leverage. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm looking to TJ, perhaps if there's any thoughts you might have on those organizations who may be in the LEAP process and are feeling a little bit stuck in the detail with the technical side of it, how they could overcome that. Not sure if I don't know if you're there, Joshua, or if you heard my question. Maybe. Maybe not. Okay, no worries. Yeah, so I think probably the guidance on that will be to go away and look at some of the resources that we've shared there. I think, really, it's great to see that you're actually into that stage of the process and assessing these things in such detail to reach those types of questions. That's really positive. I would say as well that you can also probably consider whether, you're using the tool that is right for the stage in the process you're at. So maybe looking at whether there's a different tool that could help you to overcome that hurdle, or possibly considering, whether you need some advisory support to navigate some of those details as well. And then let's have a little look. Have we got any other questions we think would be useful to respond to? I'll ask my colleagues as well if you think there's anything in particular that would be worth us highlighting. I think probably a few things we've come back to. A few people have asked questions about the Indigenous people and local communities area. We've shared the guidance in the chat there, but I think it's really key to understanding that actually this is a very integral part of the TNFD framework. It's something that was perhaps an iteration or an evolution compared to TCFD, where maybe with climate that obviously didn't quite have that interface as such with people out in our local communities. But particularly for the TNFD's methodology, when you start to really get into individual locations, of course, that becomes highly pertinent. Probably for many corporates and FIs, you're even more removed from this. It may be quite a new topic. So we'd encourage you to take away the guidance there, have a look at that as well, and just get your head around, I guess, some of the fundamentals you should be starting to think about at this stage. But as with every aspect of LEAP, an element that I'm sure will be iterative for many organizations. Tiffany, I see you're on camera as well. Is there anything you'd like to come in on here?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I just noticed that there were a lot of questions in the Q&A that have to do with, a particular unique circumstance of a company and the sector they work in. So I wanted to highlight again those sector guidance. Maybe I'll quickly find the link to and share that in the chat, because a lot of these questions coming in would really be answered in that guidance. They really look at your particular industry and what's, that interface with nature. So really, really useful, I think, tool that TNFD has developed that people can start using.
Fantastic. Thanks. I think that's a really useful point to reiterate as well. Much appreciated. All right, great. Well, with that, everyone, I think we'll move towards closing out the session now, recapping a few things and covering the all-important point about how to get your feedback, submit your feedback survey and get your certificate, which I know we'll all be keen to hear. So just to recap on what we've been looking at and learning in this session, these were our goals that we set out for ourselves at the start of the session. So we hope now that you should be in a position to be able to explain why nature is relevant to your organization, to start thinking about how you can understand dependencies, impacts, and risks, and some of the tools and resources that you can really take away to go and understand this better. We know, of course, there's a lot to learn here, but I think really the key thing, as we've said a few times, is not to be afraid to get started and to do your best within your context to have a go and get to grips with this topic. And hopefully you'll really start to see benefits in understanding this better as well. So with that, let's do a quick regroup on where we're at with our knowledge and understanding. So if you remember, we asked you this question at the start of the session, and now let's just revisit it again. So I think, remember, we're somewhere in the middle of the scale at the start of the session on how we felt we were comfortable with understanding the links between nature and business. Let's see where we're at today. So I'll leave that poll open for you to respond to. Whilst we're running that, I'll invite you as well. I see a few people have already done so, but in Menti, we've shared another question for you just to get you to reflect on your key takeaway from the training session. We know in any kind of workshop environment, there's always a load of information covered, and maybe not all of it's going to be relevant for you. Maybe some of it's going to be more pertinent. So it'd be great if you wanted to share with us maybe your key takeaway. Maybe it's an action point, a new topic that you'll plan to take forward from today. Whilst we do that, I'll end the poll and I'll share the results because I see a good amount of you have responded. I see nearly everyone is above the midpoint on the scale now, and many of you saying 8s and above on your understanding. So that's great to see. Thanks, everyone. But looking at those of you who've responded to Menti so far, thanks everyone for sharing. So someone has mentioned that they see nature as an integral part of every aspect of our lives. Exactly. I think really understanding the breadth of that is a great starting point and recognizing that reliance we have. Thanks for sharing your feedback on the training as well. That's fantastic. We really appreciate that. Some of you are feeling like LEAP in particular is something you're going to take away, which I think is definitely what we would recommend as your next step. So that's fantastic. I see mentions as well of business not being separate from nature, which indeed as well is a really key thing to highlight. So fantastic. Thanks everyone for loads of great points. Better understandings of dependencies, moving from non-financial disclosures to judge the performance of the company in the long term. Yeah. So not thinking about this as just maybe a report or a one-off exercise, but really an exercise in strategic resilience as well. And I think when you're talking to your colleagues and your leaders, I think that angle, of course, is always one that's likely to resonate. Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. So those are loads of great takeaways. I appreciate you sharing those. Let's go back to our slides now. A couple of few things to round off before we finish our session. So firstly, just to recap, and thanks for all the love as well. It's really great to see the positive reactions. It makes our job much easier knowing that we're getting good input from you all. So thanks, everyone. Just a few things to mention, and really just as a takeaway, these are all available in the slide handout, which you can access at the event page we've linked to a few times in the chat. So just to show you that all of these things are here. Firstly, we've got a reminder that the SSE has worked closely with the TNFD to develop a number of resources on this topic. So be sure to check out our model guidance on nature-related disclosures, including that nature disclosure checklist that we talked you through that's at the end of the document. And you can also access all of the resources that are linked in this presentation from the workshop handout on the event page. If you didn't watch that video of module 1 or you want to recap it, you can also find that at the same page, and the recording of this session will be added there as well. And so we've shared a lot of valuable resources from the TNFD today as well, but a final point to highlight is that the main materials they have geared towards capacity building are available on their TNFD trainer portal, learning lab, and all of these great resources here. So these are some really great resources to dive into if you want to go into more detail on a particular topic. Maybe you even want to run your own internal information session to educate your colleagues on this as well. If you go into the learning lab, you'll see there's some really great resources there to run your own workshop if you want to bring your colleagues up to speed on this. And of course, from the S&P team as well, they are available if you'd like to follow up with them to know more about how they can support you. You can find the link here in the slide to learn more about their solutions and request a specific follow-up from them as well if you'd like to talk to the team at S&P. And then I won't go through all of these in detail, but just to show you, available in the slide handout, for every module, we put a summary slide in here summarizing the key resources that we talked you through. So be sure to check that out in the slide handout if you want a good go-to reminder of all the different resources. And then finally, of course, a very important point, a big thank you for everyone who has stuck with us throughout this full 3.5 hours of training. We know that this is a long time to ask us all to spend together in the online environment, but we're really appreciative of how much energy, engagement, and enthusiasm you've all brought to this session. So a big thank you for that. And as a merit for your hard work, you're now able to receive your completion certificate for taking part in the course. So to get your certificate, you'll need to fill out the feedback survey, which Landon has shared to the chat for you. So you'll see the instructions written in the chat there as well. If you take part in that feedback survey, obviously we'd love to know your thoughts on how the training session went for you today. But what we'll do is we'll use the details that you provide in the survey to send you your certificate via email. Please look out for an email. It'll come from SimpleCert. That will provide you with the link to access your certificate. Be sure to check your junk folders if you might be missing your certificate. And also please keep in mind as well, if you know your organization has quite aggressive spam filters, maybe fill out the survey with a personal email address that might be easier to receive the certificate to as well. But if you give us about a week to send those certificates out, we'll get those to you. But if you're missing your certificate after that time, you can contact the SSE at the details available in this presentation. And last but not least, a few final words of appreciation. Firstly, a big thank you to all of the SSE supporters, a group of stock exchanges and wider organizations really committed to promoting sustainable capital markets and supporting all of our work. As a reminder, if you're interested to know more about becoming a supporter, you're welcome to contact us as well to know more about this. In particular, for today's session, we'd like to also extend our thanks again, of course, to the team at NSE for hosting us, to Vinita, to Gaurav, to Piyush and team. It's been fantastic supporting you and working together to host this session. And of course, a big thanks to all of our supporters and partners for this program, to TNFD, and particularly for Tejeshwa for joining us today, to our guest speakers, Valentina and Yusuf from the S&P Global team. And of course, a final thanks to all of you who've joined us as participants as well, and to our donors. So we'll close out our session there and give you a whole 3 minutes back to your day. But wishing you all the best and hope to see you again on another session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.